Welcome, dear listener, to another journey through the unglamorous corridors of history. Wherever you are right now, nestled under blankets in Stockholm, driving through midnight rain in Manchester, lying awake in a Tokyo apartment, I'm grateful you've chosen to spend this time together. If you find value in these wanderings through the past, consider subscribing to join our growing community of curious minds, and please, feel free to leave a comment sharing where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Tonight we're venturing into territory that popular culture conveniently ignores when depicting the Viking Age. You've seen the television shows with their warrior women fierce and independent striding across the screen in leather and determination. You've heard the sagas speak of strong Norse women who managed estates and made decisions. All of that existed to some degree. But there's another story, equally true and far more common, one written in bone and blood, in stillborn children buried beneath threshold stones, in the skeletal remains of women who died before age 30 with the physical damage of someone twice their age. We're talking about pregnancy in the Viking Age, not the romanticized version, not the empowered narrative, but the biological reality of carrying and birthing children in a world without anesthesia, without antiseptics, without any real understanding of what was happening inside a woman's body. A world where the same longhouse that sheltered you also sheltered your livestock, where birth happened on benches stained with years of blood, where 1 in 8 women died from pregnancy-related causes over their lifetime, and where watching a newborn die was so common that mothers learned not to name their children until they'd survived the first brutal year. Picture a world where pregnancy wasn't a medical condition but a fate, where fertility determined your worth, where you might give birth 10 times and bury 7 children, where your body was both your value and your death sentence. Tonight, over the next few hours, we'll explore what pregnancy actually meant for Viking women. Not in theory, not in legend, but in the archaeological record, in the bones that don't lie, in the grim statistics that survive in burial grounds across Scandinavia. So settle in. Get comfortable. This is history without the heroic gloss, the kind of boring, methodical, deeply unsettling history that helps us understand just how recently human life became something other than a brutal struggle against biology itself. Let us begin. The Viking Age, traditionally dated from 793 CE to 1066 CE, spanned roughly 3 centuries across the Scandinavian world, modern-day Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and their various settlements from Iceland to the British Isles, to the rivers of Russia. This wasn't a unified empire, but rather a collection of communities sharing linguistic and cultural similarities while maintaining distinct regional characteristics. When we discuss Viking pregnancy, we're primarily examining the experiences of women in these core Scandinavian territories, though similar conditions existed in Viking colonies abroad. The geography itself shaped reproductive realities in profound ways. Scandinavia's northern latitude meant extreme seasonal variations that directly impacted pregnancy outcomes. Winter darkness stretched for months in northern regions, limiting vitamin D production and contributing to calcium deficiency in pregnant women. The short growing season meant food scarcity was cyclical and predictable. Pregnant women in late winter faced the worst nutritional conditions precisely when their bodies needed the most resources. The landscape of fjords, mountains and forests meant communities were often isolated, with women giving birth far from any potential help beyond their immediate household. The longhouse architecture that characterised Viking settlements created specific conditions for pregnancy and childbirth. These structures, typically 30 to 70 feet long, housed extended families along with their livestock in a shared space divided by wattle and door partitions. The sleeping benches lining the walls served as living quarters, workspaces, and birthing locations. These were not separate rooms or private spaces, but shared platforms where all activities of life, including birth and death, occurred within sight and sound of everyone else. The central hearth provided heat and light, but also filled the structure with smoke, creating respiratory problems particularly dangerous for newborns. Archaeological evidence from settlements across Scandinavia paints a consistent picture of these living conditions. Excavations at sites like Borg in Norway and Ledra in Denmark reveal longhouses with earthen floors, limited ventilation, and construction designed to maximise heat retention rather than hygiene. The proximity of human sleeping areas to animal stalls, often just a few feet of separation, created conditions that modern medicine would recognise as catastrophically dangerous for childbirth. We're talking about environments where the same hands that delivered a calf in the morning might deliver a human baby in the evening, with no concept of sterilisation or disease transmission. The climate was notably colder during much of the Viking Age than it is today, part of a period climatologists identify as showing significant temperature variability. This meant harsher winters, shorter growing seasons, and increased stress on pregnant bodies already strained by poor nutrition. When we read saga descriptions of brutal winters, we should remember that each one represented a spike in maternal and infant mortality, cold that killed not through drama, but through the slow grinding down of bodies with no reserves left. Viking society operated on a fundamental principle of hierarchy and utility. Every person had a role determined by birth, gender and capability, and your value was measured by how well you fulfilled that role. For women, that role centred primarily on reproduction and household management. This wasn't unique to Viking culture, of course. Most pre-modern societies organised themselves around similar principles. What made the Viking Age particularly brutal was the intersection of these social expectations with extreme environmental conditions, limited medical knowledge, and a warrior culture that glorified men's deaths in battle, while treating women's deaths in childbirth as unremarkable. The legal structure of Viking society, documented in later law codes that preserved earlier oral traditions, reveals the status of women in matters of reproduction. Women could own property, could divorce under certain circumstances, could manage estates in their husband's absence. This has led some modern interpreters to characterise Viking women as remarkably independent. But when we examine the specifics around pregnancy and childbirth, a different picture emerges. A husband could legally reject a newborn within the first hours of life, sentencing it to exposure death, and the mother had no legal recourse. A woman's bride price and social standing were directly tied to her ability to produce children, particularly sons. Infertility was grounds for divorce, and the fault was always presumed to be the woman's. Religious beliefs surrounding pregnancy mixed practical observation with supernatural explanation in ways that made sense within their worldview, but offered little actual help. Freya, the goddess associated with fertility, love and Satyr magic, was invoked for aid in conception and childbirth. Amulets, carved runes and verbal charms represented attempts to influence outcomes that felt random and terrifying. When modern archaeologists excavate women's graves from this period, they often find these protective objects: small carved figures, inscribed metal pieces, stones with specific markings. These weren't decorative. They were desperate attempts to survive biological processes that killed without apparent reason. The sagas, written down in the 13th and 14th centuries but preserving earlier oral traditions, occasionally reference pregnancy and childbirth, but always in passing, always as background to more important events involving men. We read about women being pregnant, about children being born, but rarely about the process itself. The silence is telling. What was so commonplace, so understood, that it needed no explanation? Pregnancy wasn't a medical condition requiring intervention, but a natural state that women simply endured. The saga literature treats childbirth deaths with the same casual frequency it treats deaths from disease or old age. Unfortunate but unremarkable. The economic realities of Viking society created specific pressures around reproduction. Children represented labour, future farmers, craftspeople, traders, warriors. But children also represented mouths to feed during a period when food security was never guaranteed. The practice of infanticide by exposure wasn't cruel within their value system, it was rational resource management. A family that couldn't feed another child, a child born with visible disabilities that would prevent productive work, twins when resources could barely support one infant. These were scenarios where exposure was considered responsible decision-making rather than murder. The mother who had carried the pregnancy for 9 months, who had laboured to bring the child into the world, had no say in this decision. It was made by the male head of a household based on economic calculation. The Viking Age also coincided with significant population movement and social disruption. Raiding parties left for months at a time, meaning women were pregnant and giving birth without male partners present. Settlements in new territories like Iceland and Greenland meant establishing households in unfamiliar environments with uncertain resources. The slave trade, fundamental to Viking economics, meant thousands of women, captured in raids across Europe, were forcibly impregnated to produce more slaves. When we discuss Viking pregnancy, we're not just talking about free Norse women in established communities, but also about enslaved women with zero autonomy, and Irish, Anglo-Saxon, and Slavic women in Viking settlements far from their homes. What we're exploring over these next hours is a simple but disturbing thesis. Pregnancy in the Viking Age was a leading cause of death for women, a source of lifelong physical damage for those who survived, and a process carried out under conditions that would appall modern medical professionals. This wasn't due to any particular cruelty or ignorance specific to Viking culture. It was the baseline reality of human reproduction before modern medicine, before germ theory, before any real understanding of biology or anatomy. The statistics tell part of the story. Skeletal analysis of Viking Age burial grounds reveals that women died younger than men on average, despite men's involvement in warfare and dangerous maritime activities. The leading cause? Complications from pregnancy and childbirth. Estimates suggest that over a woman's reproductive lifetime, typically starting in the early teens and continuing into the 40s for those who survived, the cumulative risk of dying from pregnancy-related causes was roughly 1 in 8. This means every woman personally knew multiple women who had died this way. It wasn't a rare tragedy, but a common occurrence that shaped social structures and personal decisions. But the mortality statistics only capture the most dramatic outcomes. What about the women who survived? Skeletal remains tell a story of physical devastation. Bones show severe calcium depletion from repeated pregnancies on inadequate nutrition. Pelvic structures reveal fractures and deformities from difficult births. Spinal. Columns show compression damage from carrying heavy loads while pregnant and immediate postpartum. Teeth, often missing or severely decayed, reflect the way pregnancy literally leached minerals from women's bodies. A woman who bore 8 children and survived to age 40 might have the skeletal structure of a 70-year-old. Her body used up by the biological demands placed on it. The archaeological record also reveals the fate of the children themselves. Infant burial sites, both formal and informal, show staggering mortality rates. Somewhere between 30 and 50% of children died before age 5, with the highest mortality in the first year of life. This means that the average Viking woman didn't just endure the physical trauma of pregnancy and birth once or twice, but repeatedly, 6, 8, 10 times, knowing that half those children would probably die. The psychological toll of this repeated loss, combined with physical suffering, created a reality far removed from modern pregnancy experiences. Our goal tonight isn't to shock for shock's sake, but to understand. We'll move through 25 chapters, examining different aspects of Viking pregnancy. The physical spaces where birth occurred, the knowledge and techniques available to midwives, the nutritional challenges, the common complications, the social and legal status of pregnant women, the fate of the children born into this world. Each chapter will take about 5 minutes, giving us time to really sit with these realities, to understand not just what happened, but what it meant for the women who lived it. This matters because it shows us how recently our current reproductive reality came into being. The women we're discussing died less than 1,000 years ago, a blink in human history. The medical advances that make modern pregnancy relatively safe are mostly less than a century old. Antibiotics, blood transfusions, caesarean sections, prenatal care, ultrasounds, pain management, all of this is newer than your grandparents. Understanding Viking pregnancy isn't just an exercise in historical curiosity. It's a reminder of how fragile our current safety is and how much we owe to medical science. So let us proceed through these chapters methodically, examining each aspect of this difficult topic with the care and respect it deserves. The women who suffered through Viking Age pregnancies left no written accounts of their experiences, but they left their bones, their burial goods, their children's graves. We can read that evidence and reconstruct what their lives were actually like. It's boring history in the sense that it's not heroic or exciting. It's the slow, grinding, everyday reality of human bodies struggling against biology in a world without modern help. But it's also deeply important history, the kind that helps us understand what it actually meant to be human in ages past. Chapter 1. The Longhouse Birthroom. When we imagine a birth, most of us picture a hospital room, sterile, bright, equipped with monitors and trained staff. Push that image completely aside. A Viking Age birth happened on a sleeping bench in a longhouse, surrounded by smoke, livestock sounds, and the eyes of extended family members who had nowhere else to go. This was the reality for the vast majority of Scandinavian women across 3 centuries. Birth as a public, dirty, dangerous event in a multi-purpose living space. The typical longhouse birth setting would assault modern sensibilities immediately. Picture a structure maybe 50 feet long, walls made of rough timber or wattle and daub, a central hearth sending smoke upward toward a hole in the roof. Along both long walls run raised sleeping benches, perhaps 18 inches off the ground, covered with straw, furs and woven textiles that had absorbed years of sweat, blood and bodily fluids. These benches served triple duty: daytime seating, nighttime sleeping, and when necessary a place to birth children. There was no separate birthroom, no private space, no ability to control who witnessed the event. If you lived in that longhouse, you were present for every birth, willing or not. Children watched. The elderly watched. Men might leave to give symbolic privacy, but in a structure with no true walls, they heard everything. What made this truly brutal was the proximity to animals. Viking longhouses often incorporated livestock into the structure itself. Cows, pigs, goats, chickens shared the building, separated from human areas by partial walls or simple space. The practical reason made sense within their context. Body heat from animals helped warm the structure, and having livestock accessible during brutal winters was necessary for survival. But this meant a woman giving birth did so mere feet from animal stalls, with manure and urine on earthen floors that could never truly be cleaned. The same hands that had mucked stalls in the morning might be assisting with birth in the evening, with no understanding of bacterial contamination or infection risk. The smell alone, smoke, unwashed bodies, animal waste, rancid fats from food preparation, would be overwhelming to our sanitized modern senses. Archaeological excavations at sites like Borg in Norway have revealed the exact layout of these spaces. The sleeping benches where births occurred show evidence of organic staining, blood, amniotic fluid, and other fluids soaking into wood and straw over years of use. Post-hole patterns show how close human sleeping areas were to animal pens, sometimes less than 10 feet of separation. The central hearth, necessary for light and heat during birth, also created smoke inhalation risks for newborns with underdeveloped lungs. This wasn't a failure of Viking culture, but rather the reality of pre-modern life. Birth happened wherever women lived, which meant in spaces designed for survival rather than sterility. It's hard not to think of modern birth spaces, the adjustable beds, the oxygen monitors, the sterile instruments, the ability to control temperature and lighting. The Viking woman labouring on that sleeping bench had none of this. She had perhaps a midwife if she was lucky, female relatives if they were available, and the same public, dirty, smoke-filled space where she'd slept every night of her life. That was the birth room. That was where new life began, if it began at all. Chapter 2. The Midwife's Apprenticeship. Midwifery in the Viking Age wasn't a profession with formal training, but rather a skill passed down through observation and experience, often starting shockingly young. Girls as young as 10 or 12 began attending births, learning the women's work of assisting in labour. This early exposure meant that Viking girls witnessed the full reality of pregnancy and childbirth, including deaths of mothers and infants, before they had experienced menarche themselves. The education was comprehensive but traumatic, creating a generation of women who understood exactly what awaited them. Imagine being 11 years old, pulled from your play to attend a neighbour's labour because you're old enough now to learn. You sit in the corner of that smoky longhouse, watching as the labouring woman screams and sweats on the sleeping bench. The midwife, perhaps your aunt or grandmother, barks instructions, but there's a growing tension in the air. The baby isn't coming. Hours pass. The woman's strength fades. You watch as she hemorrhages blood onto the furs beneath her, as the midwife desperately tries techniques that don't work, as the other women pray to Freya for intervention that doesn't come. You watch her die, or you watch the baby come out blue and still, tiny and perfect, except for the absence of breath. This was the classroom for Viking Age midwifery, learning through the catastrophes that claimed roughly 1 in 8 mothers and countless infants. The darkest aspect of this apprenticeship system was its reliance on failure as the primary teaching tool. Midwives learned what didn't work by watching women and babies die. They learned to recognise breech presentations by feeling previous breech babies get stuck. They learned about hemorrhage by watching women bleed out despite their best efforts. They learned about infection by seeing women who survived initial labour succumb to fever days later. There were no textbooks, no anatomical drawings, no understanding of the mechanics they were trying to manipulate. Knowledge accumulated through a grim process of trial and fatal error, with each generation of midwives carrying the traumatic memories of the deaths they'd witnessed, and sometimes caused through ignorance. The sagas occasionally reference this educational process with phrases like learning the blood work or being taught the way of women's mysteries. These euphemisms covered a brutal reality, young girls being exposed to suffering and death as preparation for their own future pregnancies. Some probably excelled at this work, developing intuitive understanding of what helped and what didn't. But even the best midwife operated with profound ignorance. No knowledge of bacteria, no understanding of fetal positioning beyond what could be felt externally, no tools beyond their hands, no medications beyond herbs with questionable efficacy. They did their best within impossible constraints. So the next time you consider modern obstetric training, years of medical school, residencies under supervision, simulations and textbooks and accumulated knowledge, remember the Viking girl learning midwifery by watching neighbours die, accumulating trauma that would shape her understanding of her own body's future. The education was comprehensive, but the cost was measured in nightmares and dead women. Chapter 3. Pregnancy Determination Methods. In our age of pregnancy tests that can detect conception within days, it's difficult to imagine the uncertainty Viking women faced. There was no reliable method to confirm pregnancy in its early stages, which meant women often didn't know they were pregnant until 4 or 5 months in, when quickening, the first felt movements of the fetus, finally provided undeniable evidence. This uncertainty created a strange liminal period where women might be pregnant or might not be, with significant implications for their work, diet and planning. The physical signs we recognise today, missed periods, morning sickness, breast tenderness, were noted, but none were considered definitive. Menstruation was irregular for many women due to nutritional stress and physical demands, so a missed period might mean pregnancy or might mean nothing. Morning sickness could be confused with food poisoning or other illnesses common in an age of questionable food preservation. Without reliable external confirmation, women simply waited, continuing their normal routines until the pregnancy became physically obvious or until quickening occurred. This meant the crucial first trimester, when miscarriage risk is highest and when modern women take the most precautions, was often spent in ignorance, with women hauling water, grinding grain, and performing hard physical labour that might or might not be sustaining a pregnancy. What made this truly brutal was the implication for miscarriage and early pregnancy loss. Women who miscarried before quickening might not have even known they were pregnant. What they experienced as an unusually heavy period might have been an early miscarriage. This created a category of pregnancy loss that was entirely invisible, never mourned, never acknowledged. Even losses after women suspected pregnancy, but before confirmation, could be dismissed as uncertainty. Perhaps you weren't actually with child. The emotional toll of this ambiguity added to the physical challenges. Modern women can confirm pregnancy, track development through ultrasounds, hear heartbeats at 8 weeks. Viking women waited in uncertainty, their own bodies mysterious to them. Archaeological and textual evidence suggests various folk methods for attempting pregnancy determination. Runic inscriptions from the period include prayers asking gods to clarify whether a woman carried a child. Some historians interpret references to reading the belly as attempts at palpation to feel for fetal presence, though this would only work in later pregnancy. Urine observation, herbal tests, and various superstitious methods probably existed, but none had reliability. The best method was simply waiting. If your belly swelled and the baby moved, you were pregnant. If not, you weren't. The simplicity was also a form of ignorance. This uncertainty extended to pregnancy timing as well. Without a confirmed conception date, women couldn't predict when they'd give birth with any accuracy. The calculation from last menstruation that modern obstetrics uses wasn't available when menstruation itself was irregular and untracked. This meant women could be due for a window of several weeks, with no way to know if labour starting early meant a problem or if a prolonged pregnancy meant something was wrong. It's hard not to think about modern pregnancy apps that track development day by day versus the Viking woman who knew only sometime in the dark months and hoped she'd survive to find out. Chapter 4. The Protein Deficiency Crisis. Pregnancy increases a woman's nutritional needs dramatically. Modern obstetrics recommends an additional 300-500 calories daily, with particular emphasis on protein for fetal development and calcium for bone health. Viking women knew they needed to eat more when pregnant, but knowing and achieving were vastly different things. The harsh reality was that pregnant women often received less nutrition precisely when they needed more, creating a crisis of deprivation that damaged both mother and child. The food distribution hierarchy in Viking households prioritised men, particularly warriors, traders, and the most productive workers. This made economic sense in their survival-focused culture. Those who did the most physically demanding work or who brought in the most resources ate the best food first. Women generally ate after men, and pregnant women had no special status that elevated them in this hierarchy. The result was predictable. When resources were tight, which was often, particularly in late winter when stores ran low, pregnant women got inadequate nutrition. We're talking about women who needed extra protein, calcium and calories, instead receiving less than even their normal insufficient diet. The skeletal record from Viking Age burials tells this story with disturbing clarity. When bioarchaeologists analyse bone composition, they can detect nutritional deficiencies that occur during life. Female skeletal remains from this period show severe calcium depletion, with particular evidence in women who bore multiple children. Each pregnancy leached calcium from the mother's bones to build the baby's skeleton, and without adequate dietary calcium replacement, women's own structures deteriorated. Spinal compression fractures, early osteoporosis, tooth loss. All of this appears in the bones of women who died in their 20s and 30s, their bodies mined for resources by repeated pregnancies on inadequate nutrition. Perhaps most disturbing was the long-term consequence of this deprivation. Even if a woman survived pregnancy, she did so with permanent physical damage. Her bones were weaker, her teeth were gone, her body's reserves were depleted. This made subsequent pregnancies even more dangerous, a body already depleted trying to support new life. It was a downward spiral. Each pregnancy made the next one harder. Each child extracted resources that couldn't be replaced. Each survival came at the cost of permanent deterioration. Modern archaeologists examining Viking Age female skeletons can literally see this progression in the bones. Women who bore many children show cumulative damage that aged them decades beyond their actual years. Archaeological sites have provided specific evidence of this crisis. At a burial site in Denmark, researchers examined the skeleton of a woman who died around age 28. Bone analysis revealed she'd probably borne at least 4 children. Her skeleton showed the calcium depletion equivalent to a woman in her 60s, with spinal compression, severe dental loss, and pelvic deformities. She hadn't died dramatically. There was no evidence of violent death or sudden illness. She'd simply worn out, her body used up by the demands placed on it without adequate resources for repair. This was one woman, one grave, but her bones tell a story repeated across burial grounds throughout Scandinavia. It's impossible not to think about modern prenatal care, the vitamin supplements, the dietary counselling, the monitoring of nutrition and weight gain, the understanding of exactly what a developing fetus needs and how to provide it. The Viking woman got none of this. She got less food when she needed more, and her body paid the price in ways that damaged her permanently. We can scarcely imagine a world where pregnancy wasn't supported, but rather actively harmful due to resource competition within the household. Chapter 5. Working until labour began. Modern maternity leave policies, bed rest recommendations, and general understanding that pregnant women should reduce physical strain in late pregnancy. All of this would be completely foreign to a Viking Age woman. Pregnancy wasn't considered a condition that excused you from work. It was simply a state you happened to be in while continuing to perform all normal duties until the moment contractions became too intense to continue. This meant women hauling water, grinding grain, tending animals, and performing heavy physical labour until they literally couldn't anymore. The agricultural calendar didn't pause for pregnancy. If harvest season arrived, and you were 8 months pregnant, you still harvested. If animals needed tending in winter, and you were due any day, you still tended them. The household economy couldn't absorb a woman stopping work for weeks before birth. There was too much that had to be done, too few people to do it. So women work through pregnancy at an intensity that would alarm modern obstetricians, performing tasks that involved heavy lifting, prolonged standing, and significant physical exertion. The modern concept of taking it easy in late pregnancy simply didn't exist as an option for most women. What made this truly brutal was the documented cases of women going into labour while alone performing outdoor tasks. The sagas, normally focused on male exploits, occasionally mention women giving birth in situations that reveal the reality of their working lives. One saga references a woman who went into labour while fetching firewood in winter. She delivered the baby in the forest, cut the umbilical cord herself with a sharp stone, wrapped the infant in her cloak, and walked back to the longhouse. This wasn't presented as exceptional courage, but rather as normal behaviour, the kind of thing that simply happened when work had to be done regardless of biological timing. The risks of this approach were significant, though not recognised as such at the time. Modern medicine understands that excessive physical strain in late pregnancy can trigger premature labour, can cause placental abruption, can lead to complications. But without this medical knowledge, Viking women had no framework for understanding that their work might be directly contributing to poor outcomes. A woman who miscarried after a day of heavy labour would attribute it to fate or divine displeasure, not to the physical stress her body couldn't sustain. The connection between cause and effect remained invisible, so the patterns continued generation after generation. The expectation extended right up to the moment of crowning. Women didn't retire to a birthing room hours before delivery. They worked until contractions became impossible to work through, then moved to the sleeping bench to actually deliver. This meant no period of rest or preparation, no time to gather strength for the ordeal ahead. You were hauling water, and then you weren't, and then you were pushing out a baby. The transition was immediate and jarring, the body given no opportunity to shift from labour-intensive work to labour-intensive birth. Modern women often have hours or days of early labour where they can rest, conserve energy, prepare mentally. Viking women worked until they physically couldn't, then immediately began the most demanding physical challenge of their lives. There's a particular image that archaeological evidence and saga references combine to create. A woman alone in a field or forest, feeling the first strong contractions, realising she needs to get back to the longhouse, but unsure if she'll make it, walking through pain, while hoping she can reach help before the baby comes. Some made it, some didn't. Some gave birth in winter fields and died of exposure alongside their newborns. This wasn't dramatic or heroic. It was simply what happened when pregnancy met the unforgiving demands of subsistence agriculture in a harsh climate. So the next time you hear someone discuss maternity leave or workplace accommodations for pregnant women, remember the Viking woman in the field, working until the moment her body forced her to stop, alone with her pain and her fear and her complete lack of options. Chapter 6. The Stillbirth. Statistics. Modern obstetrics has reduced stillbirth rates in developed countries to roughly 3.5 per 1,000 births through prenatal monitoring, ultrasounds, and intervention when problems are detected. Viking Age stillbirth rates were exponentially higher. Archaeological and historical evidence suggests somewhere between 1 in 3 to 1 in 4 pregnancies ended in stillbirth or very early infant death. This means a woman bearing 6 children might expect to deliver 2 dead babies, a statistic so grim it shaped social customs and psychological coping mechanisms across Scandinavian society. The physical evidence for these stillbirth rates comes from burial archaeology. Across Viking Age sites in Scandinavia, researchers find tiny skeletal remains in unusual locations, not in formal cemeteries with grave goods and ceremony, but tucked into property boundaries beneath house thresholds, inside walls, and in unmarked pits near settlements. These burial patterns suggest stillborn infants or babies who died within hours of birth. Their deaths so common and expected that they didn't merit the formal burial rites given to children who'd survived long enough to be considered fully human. The sheer number of these remains, when researchers survey a settlement comprehensively, reveals the staggering frequency of these deaths. At some excavated farmsteads, archaeologists have found skeletal remains of more stillborn or early death infants than they found formal child burials. What made this truly brutal was the emotional calculus women had to perform. Modern women who experience stillbirth often describe it as one of life's most devastating losses. Months of pregnancy, preparation, anticipation, ended in silence and grief. But when stillbirth is expected in 1/4 to 1/3 of pregnancies, when every woman knows multiple other women who've delivered dead babies, a different psychological adaptation occurs. Women learned not to invest too deeply in pregnancy, not to celebrate or plan too enthusiastically, to maintain emotional distance from the life growing inside them, precisely because that life had such a high probability of never drawing breath. It was a form of self-protection, a way to survive in a world where hope itself could be devastating. The saga literature reflects this emotional distance in telling ways. Pregnancies are mentioned, but rarely described. There's no poetry about feeling the baby move, no joyful anticipation recorded. Births are reported as facts. She bore a son, or she gave birth to a daughter, with emotional content reserved for what happened after. Whether the child survived, whether it was accepted, whether it lived long enough to matter. One saga mentions a woman who bore 3 children, 2 of whom lived past winter. The casual notation of the 3rd child's death, not even warranted detailed mention, reveals how normalised infant loss had become. These weren't heartless people, but rather humans adapted to a statistical reality that would devastate modern sensibilities. The archaeological record also reveals attempts to understand or control these outcomes. Women's graves from the Viking Age sometimes contain amulets, carved figures, and inscribed stones that researchers interpret as fertility or childbirth protection objects. These weren't decorative jewellery but desperate tools, attempts to invoke divine protection against the 1 in 3 chance that the pregnancy would end in a dead baby. The presence of these objects in graves suggests women carried them through life, through multiple pregnancies, hoping each time that this birth would be different. Sometimes the protection worked, in the sense that the child lived. Often it didn't. The amulets ended up in graves alongside women who'd buried multiple stillborn infants despite their prayers and protections. This reminds us that people aren't statistics. Behind these 1 in 3 numbers were individual women, specific losses, particular grief that couldn't be fully expressed in a culture that expected you to try again as soon as biologically possible. Chapter 7. Infanticide by exposure. Among the most difficult aspects of Viking Age pregnancy to examine from a modern perspective is the practice of infanticide by exposure, the deliberate abandonment of newborn infants to die of exposure to the elements. This wasn't murder in the legal or social sense within Viking culture, but rather an accepted practice for managing resources and selecting viable offspring. Understanding this requires setting aside modern ethical frameworks and examining the brutal economic calculations that govern survival in a subsistence society, while also recognising the horror of what this meant for women who'd carried pregnancies to term. The practice was legally codified in Viking law codes, which specified the exact process. When a child was born, it was placed on the ground. The father or male head of household examined the infant, looking for visible deformities, assessing its size and apparent health, and making a decision based on household resources. If he chose to accept the child, water was sprinkled on it in a naming ceremony, and it became part of the family with legal protection. If he rejected it, the child was taken outside and left to die of exposure, usually cold, sometimes also exposure to animals. The mother who'd carried the pregnancy for 9 months, who'd laboured to deliver the child, who might have felt it move inside her for months, had absolutely no legal say in this decision. Her body's 9 months of work could be negated in the first hour of the infant's life. The darkest aspect of this practice was its systematic logic. In a society where food security was never guaranteed, where winter could kill through starvation, where every mouth to feed represented a calculation of survival, infanticide made grim sense. A family that couldn't feed another child chose to let a newborn die, rather than risk all members starving. Twins presented an especially tragic calculation. Resources that could barely support 1 additional infant certainly couldn't support 2, so 1 or both were often exposed. Infants born with visible disabilities that would prevent future productive work were rejected as unsustainable investments. Infants born to slaves had even less protection. The master decided their fate based purely on economic utility. From within their framework, these were rational decisions. From outside it, they represent a horror of calculated infanticide. The sagas record this practice with disturbing casualness. One mentions a man being told his wife gave birth to a daughter, and him responding, "Leave it out for the wolves." Another describes a woman secretly rescuing an exposed infant that her husband had rejected, hiding and nursing it until the child was large enough that rejection became socially difficult. These weren't presented as shocking moral failures, but rather as normal events, the kind of household decisions that happened and sometimes caused domestic conflict, but didn't warrant extended commentary. The saga writers and their audiences understood exposure as a fact of life, like bad harvests or harsh winters, regrettable perhaps, but necessary. Archaeological evidence for exposure is difficult to find because exposed infants generally weren't buried. They were left where they died, their small bones scattered or consumed by scavengers. But occasionally researchers find evidence: infant remains in refuse pits, tiny bones in locations far from settlements, patterns of early infant death that suggest selection rather than natural causes. At some Viking Age sites in Iceland, where settlement archaeology is particularly well preserved, researchers have found suspicious patterns of single infant bones in isolation, suggesting bodies left outside according to exposure practice rather than succumbing to natural infant mortality and receiving burial. It's impossible to know the psychological toll this took on mothers. In a culture that expected it, that presented it as necessary and normal, did women accept these losses with less grief than modern mothers would feel? Or did they grieve in silence, knowing their sorrow was inappropriate for a practice everyone else accepted? Some saga references to women's sadness after birthing might reference postpartum depression, but might also reference the grief of having laboured for hours to deliver a living baby, only to have it taken out into the cold by male relatives who decided it wasn't worth keeping. The mothers left no written records of these feelings, but the silence itself is revealing. This was women's pain, too private and too common to merit male saga writers' attention. So the next time someone romanticizes Viking society's strength and practicality, remember that those qualities included fathers calculating whether a newborn should live or die, while mothers who'd carried that life had no voice in the decision. Chapter 8. Breech birth. Survival rates. In modern obstetrics, breech presentation, when the baby is positioned feet or bottom first rather than head first, occurs in about 3-4% of full-term pregnancies and is managed through external cephalic version attempts or planned caesarean section. The Viking Age had neither option. When a baby presented breech, the only choice was attempting vaginal delivery of a fetus coming out the wrong way, a process that frequently killed both mother and infant over hours or days of suffering. This was one of the most feared complications, recognisable to midwives and utterly beyond their ability to resolve. Picture the scenario: a woman in active labour for many hours, pushing with all her strength, but the baby not descending properly. The midwife, checking with her hands, feels not the hard roundness of a head, but something softer, perhaps buttocks, perhaps feet. She knows what this means because she's seen it before. She knows the baby is coming bottom first, that the head, the largest part, will come last, that if the body delivers but the head gets stuck, the baby will strangle on its own umbilical cord while still partly inside the mother. She knows the mother will tear extensively trying to push out a baby in this position, and she knows there's essentially nothing that can be done except continue and hope. What made breech births truly brutal was the timeline of suffering they imposed. A typical head-first birth might take hours. A breech birth could take days. The mother pushed and pushed, exhausting herself, while the baby slowly descended in the wrong orientation. Sometimes the body would deliver, but the head would get stuck at the cervix or pelvis, creating a nightmarish situation where the baby was partly born but couldn't complete delivery. The mother would continue pushing while the midwife tried desperately to manipulate the stuck head, often without success. The baby would die of asphyxiation while still inside the mother. The mother, already exhausted, would then have to push out a dead baby's head, often tearing extensively in the process. If she survived the delivery itself, infection from the prolonged labour and extensive tearing frequently killed her in the following days. The saga literature includes oblique references to difficult births and prolonged labours that likely included breech presentations. One saga mentions a woman who laboured for 3 days and nights before dying, with no surviving child. This pattern suggests a breech presentation that ended in both deaths. Another mentions a woman who was never the same after her last birthing, walking always with pain, possible pelvic damage from a traumatic breech delivery. These weren't medical texts providing diagnoses, but rather narrative records that mentioned these events in passing, suggesting they were common enough to not require detailed explanation. Everyone who heard these stories would understand what prolonged difficult labour ending in death meant because they'd witnessed it themselves. Modern medicine's ability to detect breech presentation before labour begins, to attempt turning the baby, to perform caesarean section if necessary. These interventions have made breech birth survivable and even routine. The Viking midwife had none of these options. She couldn't see inside the womb to know the baby's position until labour was well underway. She had no surgical option to extract the baby. She had no anaesthesia to offer the suffering mother. Her tools were her hands, her experience, and her prayers to Freya. Sometimes, through skill or luck or divine intervention, both mother and baby survived a breech birth. More often, at least one died, and frequently both perished together in a drawn-out process that traumatised everyone present. The remains of women buried with fetal bones still inside their bodies tell this story archaeologically. At several Viking Age burial sites, researchers have found female skeletons with tiny fetal bones in the pelvic cavity, evidence of women who died undelivered or partially delivered, with the baby still inside. Analysis of these remains sometimes shows the fetal position, and breech presentations appear in this archaeological record. These are the dramatic failures, the cases where labour stopped before completion, and mother and child were buried together. How many more women suffered through breech deliveries that eventually completed, but left them permanently damaged or dying of infection days later? The archaeological record can't tell us that, but the saga references to women dying shortly after birthing suggest the number was substantial. We can scarcely imagine facing this complication, knowing it might happen, recognising it when labour began, understanding you had no options except suffering through it and hoping you'd be the exception who survived. Chapter 9. The hemorrhage problem. Postpartum hemorrhage, excessive bleeding after delivery, remains one of the most dangerous complications of childbirth, even with modern medicine. In the Viking Age, when a woman began bleeding heavily after delivery, there was essentially nothing that could be done except watch and hope it stopped on its own. No blood transfusions, no surgical interventions, no medications to cause uterine contraction. No way to replace the blood volume being lost onto the sleeping bench and earthen floor. Hemorrhage was a leading cause of maternal death, and women died from it quickly, their families helpless to do anything but pray. The mechanics of postpartum hemorrhage would have been mysterious to Viking Age observers. After the baby delivered, the placenta needed to separate from the uterine wall and be expelled. Then the uterus needed to contract back down, effectively clamping off the blood vessels that had been feeding the placenta. Any interruption in this process retained placental fragments, uterine atony, lacerations, could cause severe bleeding. To people without anatomical knowledge, it simply appeared that some women bled after birth and some didn't, with no apparent pattern or explanation. The actual causes: pieces of placenta preventing proper contraction, exhausted uterine muscles failing to contract, tears through blood vessels during delivery, were invisible and unknowable. A woman could deliver seemingly successfully, and then minutes or hours later, begin bleeding to death with no warning and no clear reason. Perhaps most disturbing was the speed and inevitability once severe hemorrhage began. A woman could lose enough blood to die in less than an hour. The midwife and attending women would try everything they knew, pressing on the abdomen to try to make the uterus contract, packing the vagina with cloth to stem bleeding, positioning the woman in various ways, giving her herbal concoctions, praying. None of this addressed the actual problem. If the uterus wouldn't contract, if placental fragments remained, if a major vessel had torn, the bleeding continued regardless of interventions. The attending women literally watched her bleed out onto the furs and straw, her face going pale, her consciousness fading, her breathing becoming shallow, and then stopping. The whole household witnessed this, including any children present, and the newborn baby who just lost its mother within hours of birth. The saga literature contains references that almost certainly describe hemorrhage deaths. Phrases like, "she bled greatly after birthing and died ere morning," or "the birth blood would not cease," appear in contexts that suggest postpartum hemorrhage. One saga mentions a woman who died while nursing her newborn for the first time, the baby at her breast when she suddenly began bleeding heavily and died within the hour. This pattern of sudden hemorrhage after seeming success in delivery is characteristic of retained placental fragments or delayed uterine atony. These weren't rare, unusual deaths warranting extensive commentary, but rather common enough occurrences that saga writers mentioned them in passing as one of the various ways women died. Archaeological evidence for hemorrhage deaths is difficult to find because the cause leaves no marks on bone. However, grave goods sometimes hint at this cause of death. Women buried with newborn infants, suggesting both died around the time of birth, sometimes have unusually large amounts of textile grave goods, which some researchers interpret as having been used to try to stanch bleeding. At one burial in Norway, a young woman was found buried with a newborn, with evidence of extensive textile staining and a quantity of cloths far beyond normal grave good patterns. The interpretation was that she'd hemorrhaged after delivery, with family using every available textile to try to stop the bleeding, then burying these blood-soaked materials with her body. This was one woman, one grave, but her burial goods tell a story of desperate, failed attempts to save her as she bled to death on that sleeping bench. Modern interventions for postpartum hemorrhage, medications like oxytocin to cause contraction, surgical repair of lacerations, blood transfusions to replace lost volume, hysterectomy as a last resort, have made this complication survivable in most cases. The Viking woman experiencing hemorrhage had none of this. She had women pressing on her belly, cloths being packed inside her, prayers being said over her, and then death as her blood volume dropped below sustainable levels. It happened quickly enough that she might not have had time to say goodbye to her family, or meet the baby she'd carried for 9 months. This is why women feared childbirth not as a vague abstract danger, but as a specific, well-known way that their sisters, cousins, mothers and neighbours had died. Quickly, bloodily, helplessly, despite everyone's best efforts. So the next time you hear statistics about maternal mortality in the developing world, or read about the importance of access to emergency obstetric care, remember the Viking woman bleeding out on her sleeping bench, the earthen floor turning dark with her blood, her family watching in horror as she slipped away in less time than it had taken to deliver the baby. Chapter 10. Infection in dirty conditions. If hemorrhage was the immediate killer after childbirth, infection was the delayed executioner, claiming women days or weeks after deliveries that initially seemed successful. We now know this as puerperal fever or childbed fever, infection of the uterus, vaginal tract, or birth-related wounds that spreads through the bloodstream causing sepsis and death. In the Viking Age, when births occurred in spaces shared with livestock, when the same hands that handled animal waste handled deliveries, when there was no concept of sterilisation or bacterial contamination, postpartum infection was devastatingly common and essentially untreatable once it took hold. Consider the infection vectors present at a typical Viking birth. The woman delivered on a sleeping bench that had absorbed bodily fluids from years of use, that had been in contact with unwashed bodies, that couldn't be sterilised. The attending midwife's hands had performed farm work earlier that day, mucking stalls, milking animals, preparing. Food, with no real washing beyond rinsing with cold water. The textiles used during birth, to absorb blood, to wrap the baby, to provide warmth, had been washed in cold water without soap and had never been truly sterilised. The nearby animal stalls provided a constant source of bacteria, including dangerous fecal pathogens. The earthen floor, impossible to clean thoroughly, harboured everything that had spilled on it over the years. Birth involved extensive contact between the outside world and the woman's internal reproductive organs, exactly the conditions bacteria need to cause deadly infection. The progression of puerperal fever was nightmarish. A few days after delivery, when the woman should have been recovering, she instead developed a fever. She felt chills despite the longhouse heat. Her lower abdomen became increasingly painful and tender. The post-delivery discharge that should have been decreasing instead became heavier, foul-smelling, sometimes purulent. She became disoriented as the infection spread to her bloodstream. Her fever spiked higher. Eventually, if the infection wasn't controlled, and without antibiotics it almost never was, she died of septic shock, her body overwhelmed by bacterial infection that had entered through the birth injuries in her reproductive tract. This could happen to women who'd had easy deliveries and difficult ones, to first-time mothers and experienced ones. The common factor was bacteria, invisible and ununderstood, turning a successful birth into a death sentence days later. What made this truly brutal was the helplessness of everyone involved. The woman's family recognised the pattern: fever after birthing, the bad smell, the increasing pain and confusion. They'd seen it before with other women, they knew what was coming. But there was nothing to do except try to keep her comfortable, perhaps give her fever-reducing herbs that did nothing for the underlying infection, and watch as the fever consumed her. She might die quickly, within a few days of symptom onset. She might linger for a week or more, gradually weakening as the infection spread. Either way, the outcome was almost always the same. A woman who'd successfully delivered a healthy baby, who'd survived the immediate dangers of hemorrhage and trauma, who was nursing her infant and seemed to be recovering, suddenly sickened and died from something no one could see or understand. The saga references to women dying days after birthing, or taking ill after the birth work and never recovering, almost certainly describe puerperal fever in many cases. One saga mentions a woman who bore a strong son and seemed well, but on the 5th day took fever and died on the 7th. This timeline, initial apparent success followed by fever onset around day 3 to 5 and death within a week, is characteristic of postpartum infection. Another saga notes a woman who gave birth in harvest time and was dead ere the harvest ended, suggesting death within weeks of delivery, possibly from slower developing infection or from initial infection that took longer to prove fatal. These weren't unusual, remarkable deaths, but rather common patterns everyone recognised. Archaeological evidence for infection deaths is, like hemorrhage, invisible in the skeletal record because bacteria don't leave marks on bone. However, mass burial sites and cemetery patterns sometimes reveal circumstantial evidence. At some Viking Age cemeteries, researchers find clusters of young women buried in close temporal proximity, suggesting deaths within short periods of each other, with some graves containing newborns or grave goods associated with childbirth. While individual causes can't be determined, the pattern of multiple young women dying around the same time in a community small enough that this wasn't statistically expected suggests infection as a likely cause, possibly spread between mothers by midwives who attended multiple births without understanding contamination. Modern infection control, hand-washing, sterile instruments, clean birthing environments, antibiotic treatment has made puerperal fever rare and usually treatable. The Viking woman had none of these protections. She gave birth in filth, was attended by contaminated hands, and if infection took hold, she simply died. It's hard not to think about how recently this changed, how many women across all of human history died this way, and how much we owe to germ theory and antibiotics for the fact that postpartum infection is no longer a death sentence. We can scarcely imagine accepting birth in the same space as livestock manure, but that was their reality, and infection was the inevitable price paid in women's lives. Chapter 11. Multiple Pregnancy. Toll on bodies, modern reproductive medicine understands pregnancy as a significant biological stress that affects nearly every system in the body: cardiovascular, skeletal, endocrine, immune. With proper nutrition, prenatal care, and adequate spacing between pregnancies, most women's bodies can recover fully between births. Viking women had none of these advantages. They were expected to bear children continuously throughout their reproductive years, typically from mid-teens to early 40s, with minimal recovery time between pregnancies. The cumulative toll of 6, 8, 10 pregnancies on inadequate nutrition created physical damage that aged women decades beyond their chronological years. Each pregnancy extracted resources from the mother's body to build the fetus: calcium for bones, iron for blood, protein for tissue development. In well-nourished modern women with vitamin supplementation, these resources are replaced between pregnancies. In Viking women on marginal nutrition, where men ate first and best, these resources were never fully replaced before the next pregnancy began. Imagine a bank account that's drawn down repeatedly without sufficient deposits. Eventually the account is depleted. That's what happened to Viking women's bodies. The first pregnancy might leach calcium from bones. The second would leach more from an already depleted skeleton. The third more still. By the 6th or 7th pregnancy, the woman's bones were structurally compromised. Her teeth were falling out from mineral depletion. Her spine was compressing under loads it could no longer support. The skeletal evidence for this cumulative damage is stark and disturbing. When bioarchaeologists examine Viking Age female remains, they can often estimate how many pregnancies a woman endured based on the degree of skeletal deterioration. Women who bore many children show spinal compression fractures, severe osteoporosis, pelvic deformities from repeated births, and dental loss far beyond what age alone would explain. At one burial site in Sweden, researchers examined a woman who died around age 35. Bone density analysis suggested she'd borne at least 7 children. Her skeleton showed compression fractures in multiple vertebrae, severe calcium depletion throughout her bone structure, complete loss of molars, and pelvic stress fractures. The lead researcher noted that her skeletal age appeared to be 65 or older. She'd aged 30 years beyond her chronological age due to reproductive demands on her body. What made this truly brutal was that the damage was cumulative and permanent. Modern women who experience bone density loss during pregnancy can recover with proper nutrition and calcium supplementation. Viking women never recovered. Each pregnancy made them weaker, more damaged, less able to handle the next pregnancy. It was a downward spiral with no bottom. The woman who'd borne 5 children and was pregnant with her 6th was approaching that pregnancy with a body already depleted by the previous 5, making complications more likely, recovery harder, death more probable, and if she survived, she'd be even more depleted for the 7th pregnancy. The saga literature occasionally mentions women who are worn out by birthing, or who bore many children and was never strong thereafter. These references, brief and casual, describe the reality of women whose bodies had simply been used up by repeated pregnancies. One saga mentions a woman who walked bent like an old woman though she had not yet 40 winters, suggesting the spinal compression and skeletal damage of multiple pregnancies. Another describes a mother who had no teeth left to chew and must have her food softened, likely describing dental loss from calcium depletion in someone who should have been middle-aged but had the physical deterioration of the elderly. Gravesites sometimes reveal this story in heartbreaking detail. At a farmstead excavation in Norway, researchers found the grave of a woman buried with what appeared to be the tools of her household work: weaving implements, food preparation items, evidence that she'd been a productive household member. Her skeleton told a different story. She died around age 32. She'd borne at least 6 children based on pelvic markers. Her spine showed 3 compression fractures. Her hip joints showed early degenerative disease. Her bone density was severely depleted. She'd been working, the grave goods showed that, but working with a body that was essentially broken down by repeated pregnancies, This was her reward for fulfilling her society's primary expectation of women. Her body was used up and she died young. So the next time you hear someone discuss family planning or birth spacing or reproductive choice, remember the Viking woman whose body was mined for resources by pregnancy, after pregnancy with no chance for recovery, who aged decades and years, whose bones tell a story of biological exploitation that was simply considered normal. Chapter 12. Winter. Births. Childbirth was dangerous year-round in the Viking Age, but winter births presented a particular horror. The conflict between warmth and ventilation in a longhouse, the risk of newborns freezing to death within minutes of delivery, the limited help available when neighbours were snowbound, and the resource scarcity that made every new mouth to feed even more problematic. When a woman went into labour during the dark months, everyone present understood the odds were worse than usual, and the baby's survival through the first hours was far from guaranteed. The physical challenge began with the birthing environment itself. The longhouse in winter was a closed system designed to retain every possible bit of heat. Smoke from the central hearth filled the upper space before slowly escaping through a roof hole that was often partially covered to prevent heat loss. Opening doors or enlarging ventilation holes meant potentially lethal cold flooding into the space. But birth was a bloody, messy process that required some level of ventilation, some ability to see clearly, some way to manage the smoke that could suffocate a newborn with underdeveloped lungs. Women in winter labour faced an impossible choice: give birth in a smoke-filled space that might asphyxiate the baby, or open ventilation and risk the newborn freezing to death in the Arctic air. What made winter births truly brutal was the temperature shock for the newborn. A baby in the womb experiences constant warmth, 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit or higher. They emerge into the world expecting similar temperatures. In a heated modern hospital, this transition is managed carefully with warming lamps, warm blankets, skin-to-skin contact, and controlled room temperature. In a Viking longhouse in January, the baby emerged from a warm womb into air that might be 40-50 degrees Fahrenheit away from the hearth, possibly much colder near walls, or if ventilation had been open for the birth. The baby, wet with amniotic fluid and blood, faced immediate evaporative cooling on top of the temperature difference. Without quick action, drying, warming, wrapping, the newborn could develop hypothermia within minutes. The saga literature contains oblique references to the dangers of winter birth. Phrases like, "the child was born in deep winter and did not survive the night," appear with disturbing frequency. Archaeological evidence supports this pattern. At several Viking Age burial sites, researchers analysing seasonal death patterns based on burial timing and conditions find significant spikes in infant deaths during winter months. At one cemetery in Iceland, where preservation conditions allowed detailed temporal analysis, researchers found that infant burials clustered heavily in what would have been December through February, with rates 2 to 3 times higher than summer months. Some of these deaths were probably from other causes, disease, malnutrition, but the pattern suggests temperature-related deaths of newborns as a significant factor. The resource calculation also made winter births particularly fraught. A baby born in summer arrived when food was relatively abundant, when mother could access fresh foods to support milk production, when the household economy could more easily absorb another mouth to feed. A baby born in deep winter arrived when stores were running low, when mother was nutritionally depleted from the dark months, when every additional person sharing limited food made the household survival more precarious. This reality made exposure decisions, the choice to leave a newborn outside to die, more common for winter births. The economic calculation was simply harder to justify when food security was most questionable. There's a particular archaeological finding that illustrates this horror. At a Viking Age farmstead in northern Norway, researchers excavating the area just outside the longhouse door found the skeletal remains of 3 newborn infants buried in what appeared to be winter soil conditions, frozen ground that had been broken through with difficulty. The positioning and lack of grave goods suggested these were exposed infants who had been left outside and later given minimal burial when discovered. The timing, all three in winter deposits, suggested the pattern of winter births being more likely to result in exposure decisions. 3 babies, 3 winter nights, 3 calculations that resources couldn't stretch to support another life. It's hard not to think about modern birth. Climate-controlled rooms, warming equipment, the ability to immediately dry and warm a newborn, the certainty that temperature won't be a factor in survival. The Viking woman labouring in winter knew her baby faced immediate deadly cold the moment it emerged. She knew families sometimes made exposure decisions based partly on seasonal resource availability. She knew winter births had worse outcomes generally, and there was nothing she could do about it except hope her baby was born strong, hope her household decided to keep it, hope it survived those crucial first hours when freezing was a real and present danger. We can scarcely imagine giving birth with the knowledge that the season itself was an additional threat to your baby's survival, but that was their reality. And infant graves in winter-frozen ground testify to how often that threat became reality. Chapter 13. The isolation factor. After successfully delivering a baby and surviving the immediate postpartum dangers, a Viking woman entered a period of isolation based on beliefs about ritual uncleanliness. Birth was considered a polluting event. The blood, the bodily fluids, the intimate physical processes were seen as contaminating in a spiritual sense. Women who'd just given birth were often separated from normal community activities, unable to participate in religious ceremonies, required to stay within the longhouse or family compound for weeks. This isolation, meant to protect the community from spiritual contamination, actually meant that women suffering postpartum complications were isolated from help precisely when they might most need it. The concept of postpartum uncleanliness existed across many cultures in this period, but Viking practices appear to have been particularly restrictive. References in law codes and saga literature suggest women were expected to remain isolated for approximately 6 weeks after birth, the same period that would later become formalised in Christian churching ceremonies. During this time, the woman couldn't attend public gatherings, couldn't participate in legal proceedings, couldn't engage in normal social interactions outside her immediate household. She was expected to stay within the domestic space, caring for her newborn while her body recovered, cut off from the broader community that might notice if she was developing complications. What made this isolation truly dangerous was its interaction with postpartum health problems. Modern postpartum care involves regular checkups, monitoring for warning signs of infection or hemorrhage, assessment of mental health, and community support systems. The isolated Viking woman had none of this. If she developed postpartum infection, the fever and pain progressed without anyone outside her immediate household knowing. If she suffered from postpartum depression or psychosis, her symptoms manifested in isolation without community recognition or support. If she had ongoing bleeding or other complications, she managed them alone or with only household members present. The isolation meant that problems could develop and worsen without the intervention that a more connected community might have provided. The saga literature occasionally references women's isolation after birth in ways that hint at its problematic nature. One saga mentions a woman who stayed within after birthing and when finally emerged was much changed, walking with difficulty and in pain. The phrasing suggests she suffered complications during the isolation period that went untreated, or inadequately treated because she was cut off from broader help. Another saga describes a woman who took to her bed after birthing and did not rise again, dying in her 3rd week within, suggesting complications that developed and proved fatal during the isolation period without outside intervention. Archaeological evidence for this practice is indirect but suggestive. Some Viking Age longhouses show evidence of separate sleeping or resting areas that might have been used for postpartum isolation, spaces separated by partial walls or curtains, enough to create symbolic separation from the main household activity. At one excavated site, researchers found an area near the sleeping benches with evidence of extensive textile use and organic staining consistent with bodily fluids, suggesting this area might have been where postpartum women stayed during their isolation period. The location, technically inside the longhouse but separated from main areas, reflects the liminal status of postpartum women, part of the household but temporarily removed from full participation. The psychological toll of this isolation added to the physical challenges. Modern understanding of postpartum mental health emphasises the importance of social support, community connection, and not isolating new mothers. The Viking isolation practice did exactly the opposite, removing women from community support precisely when they were most vulnerable. A woman suffering postpartum depression would experience it in isolation, without the normalising effect of seeing other mothers, without the support of broader community connections. A woman experiencing postpartum psychosis, a dangerous condition that can lead to harm, would manifest symptoms alone, with only household members who might not recognise the severity. The isolation meant that mental health crises, like physical health crises, developed without appropriate intervention. There's a particular cruelty to this practice when we consider it comprehensively. A woman endured pregnancy, survived the dangers of childbirth, and then, as her reward, was isolated from her community for 6 weeks. If she developed complications, physical or mental, she suffered them alone or nearly alone. If she needed help, support, or simply the comfort of social connection, during one of life's most vulnerable periods, she was denied it based on beliefs about spiritual contamination. This wasn't malice, but rather the intersection of religious belief with practical outcomes that were often harmful. So the next time you hear about postpartum support groups, community nursing visits, or the importance of not isolating new mothers, remember the Viking woman confined to her longhouse for 6 weeks after giving birth. Her pain and fear experienced alone. Her complications developing without the help that broader community awareness might have provided. The isolation that was meant to protect the community may have killed the mothers, one isolated complication at a time. Chapter 14. Child. Survival to age 5. For modern parents in developed countries, the expectation is that their children will survive to adulthood. Infant and child mortality are rare enough to be tragic exceptions rather than common experiences. Viking parents had no such expectation. Archaeological evidence and burial patterns suggest that roughly 40–50% of children born alive didn't survive to age 5. This meant parents faced an agonizing reality. Investing emotionally in a child who had nearly even odds of dying, or maintaining emotional distance to protect themselves from the grief that was more likely than not. The psychological adaptation to this statistical reality shaped parenting, family dynamics, and how women experienced their reproductive lives. The death threats children faced were numerous and overlapping. Exposure killed some in the first hours. Hypothermia, particularly in winter births, killed more in the first days. Infections, respiratory, gastrointestinal, skin, killed continuously through the first years, with no antibiotics or effective treatments. Malnutrition during food-scarce periods killed the weakest. Accidents in the dangerous environment of a longhouse and farm killed others. Diseases we now prevent with vaccines. Measles, whooping cough, others whose names we don't even know. Killed in waves that swept through communities. Each child who survived had made it past dozens of potential causes of death, and parents had watched helplessly as some children thrived while their siblings died for no apparent reason. What made this truly brutal for mothers was the way it corrupted the bond between parent and child. Modern psychology understands attachment, the deep emotional bond between parent and infant, as crucial for child development and parent well-being. But when that attachment sets you up for devastating grief half the time, the human psyche adapts. Women learned not to invest too deeply in newborns, not to celebrate too enthusiastically, not to make long-term plans for a child who might not see their second winter. The saga literature reflects this with references to children not being formally named until they'd survived a certain period, sometimes weeks, sometimes months, sometimes a full year. The delayed naming wasn't superstition but psychological protection. Naming a child makes it real, makes it a person, makes the grief of loss that much harder. Archaeological evidence for child mortality appears everywhere researchers look. At Viking Age cemeteries, child graves cluster thick around settlements. Small burials, often without the elaborate grave goods given to adults, sometimes marked only by a stone or a location that family members would remember. At some excavated sites, child graves outnumber adult graves, suggesting just how common these deaths were. One cemetery in Denmark, extensively excavated and analysed, revealed that nearly 45% of burials were of children under age 5, with peak mortality in the first year of life. These weren't dramatic, memorable deaths, but rather the steady, relentless toll of childhood in a world without modern medicine. These saga references to child death are remarkably casual, suggesting how normalised these losses had become. Phrases like, "She bore 5 children, 3 of whom lived," or "The winter took 2 of his young ones," appear without extended commentary or emotional weight. One saga mentions a woman who bore 8 children and raised 4, the deaths of 4 children warranting only a numerical notation rather than individual stories. This wasn't heartlessness, but rather adaptation to reality where individual child deaths were too common to receive detailed attention. If saga writers had stopped to properly mourn every child death, the text would have been nothing but mourning. The psychological toll on mothers who repeatedly bonded with and buried children doesn't appear explicitly in the historical record because women didn't write the sagas, but we can infer it from biological and archaeological evidence. Women who bore many children and buried half of them weren't experiencing occasional tragedy. They were experiencing repeated, lifelong grief punctuated by brief periods of hope when a new baby survived its first months. This chronic grief, combined with the physical toll of repeated pregnancies and the social pressure to keep bearing children despite the losses, created a level of psychological suffering that had no outlet, no treatment, no acknowledgement. Modern women who experience infant loss have support groups, therapy, social recognition of their grief. Viking women had only the expectation that they'd try again as soon as biologically possible, that their personal grief was less important than their reproductive function. There's a particular grave from Iceland that captures this reality with heartbreaking clarity. Archaeologists excavated what appeared to be a family plot, 2 adults and 5 children buried in close proximity. Skeletal analysis revealed the adult female had died around age 35, with pelvic markers suggesting she'd borne at least 8 children. 5 children were buried near her. 3 were missing, either buried elsewhere, lost to scavengers through exposure, or having survived to adulthood and moved away. This woman had borne 8 children, buried at least 5, and died relatively young with a body showing severe reproductive damage. Her grave tells a story of a life spent pregnant, birthing, nursing, burying, and then pregnant again. It's hard not to look at modern infant mortality rates, around 5-6 per 1,000 in developed countries, and think about the Viking mother who could expect to bury 40-50% of her children, and was expected to simply accept this as normal. We can scarcely imagine that reality, but it was theirs, and the small graves clustered around every settlement testify to how common it was. Chapter 15. The Maternal Mortality Reality. We've discussed various specific dangers: hemorrhage, infection, breech birth, exposure to cold, but now we need to examine the comprehensive picture, the lifetime risk of dying from pregnancy-related causes. Modern maternal mortality in developed countries is around 15 to 20 deaths per 100,000 live births. In the Viking Age, based on skeletal analysis and demographic modelling, the lifetime risk of maternal death was approximately 1 in 8. meaning over a woman's reproductive lifetime of potentially 6 to 10 pregnancies, she had roughly a 12-13% chance of dying from pregnancy or childbirth-related causes. This isn't a 12% risk per pregnancy, but a cumulative risk across all pregnancies. The more children you bore, the more often you rolled the dice, the higher your eventual odds of maternal death. This statistic shaped everything about how Viking society thought about women and reproduction. Every woman personally knew multiple women who died in childbirth or from pregnancy complications. Not distant relatives or historical figures, but neighbours, friends, sisters, mothers. Every pregnancy carried the knowledge that this might be the one that killed you. Childbirth wasn't a medical event, but a form of warfare. Women's warfare, where battle might kill you just as surely as sword and shield killed men, but with less glory and less social recognition. Men who died in battle received elaborate funerals, were remembered in sagas, earned a place in Valhalla according to religious belief. Women who died in childbirth received burial and were forgotten, their deaths too common to warrant extended memory. The skeletal evidence for maternal mortality appears in cemetery patterns that are both striking and disturbing. When archaeologists survey Viking Age burial grounds and analyse the age and sex distribution of remains, they consistently find an excess of young female deaths, women dying in their late teens through their 30s at rates significantly higher than comparably aged men. The peak death age for Viking women falls in the prime reproductive years, from approximately ages 18 to 35. The most common identifiable causes: pelvic deformities suggesting death in childbirth, skeletal markers of recent pregnancy, burial with fetal remains, and age circumstance patterns consistent with postpartum infection. While individual cause of death is often unknowable, the overall pattern is clear. Women died young, and reproduction was a leading cause. What made this truly brutal was the certainty it created. Unlike modern pregnancy, where complications are relatively rare and maternal death is exceptional, Viking women approached pregnancy knowing that death was a statistically significant possibility they were likely to personally experience or witness repeatedly. This wasn't abstract. It was the lived experience of their community. At a typical Viking settlement of perhaps 50-100 people, with maybe 10-15 women of reproductive age, you'd expect to see 1 or 2 maternal deaths every few years. Everyone knew these women. Everyone attended their funerals. Everyone understood that this was part of the price women paid for the society's continuation. It created a fatalistic attitude toward pregnancy that appears in the historical record as casual acceptance rather than outrage or grief. The saga literature reflects this fatalism with remarkable consistency. Pregnancy deaths are mentioned as facts, like deaths from disease or old age, unfortunate but unremarkable. One saga lists 3 generations of women. Sigrid bore 5 children and died birthing the 5th. Her daughter Astrid bore 4 and died birthing the 3rd. Astrid's daughter Gudrun bore 7 and lived to old age. The casual notation of 2 maternal deaths across 3 generations, presented as simple biographical facts without emotional weight, suggests how normalised these deaths had become. Another saga describes a wedding where the groom's mother is absent, and it's noted she died bearing his younger brother 3 years past, mentioned in passing as background information rather than as a tragedy requiring elaboration. Archaeological evidence from family burial plots sometimes reveals the generational pattern of maternal death. At one excavated farmstead in Norway, researchers identified what appeared to be a multi-generational family plot spanning roughly 100 years. Among the female burials, they found 3 women who died in their 20s or early 30s, with evidence suggesting pregnancy or recent childbirth as cause. The generational spacing suggested these might have been grandmother, mother and daughter, 3 generations of women from the same family who all died in the same way, bearing children. This wasn't exceptional bad luck, but rather the statistical reality playing out across generations. When 1 in 8 women die from pregnancy causes, many families experience multiple maternal deaths across the generations. The psychological weight of this reality for women is something we can only imagine. Every pregnancy begun with the knowledge that this might be fatal. Every labour started with the awareness that death was a possible outcome. Every successful birth was followed by weeks of worry about infection or other delayed complications, and this repeated 6, 8, 10 times over a reproductive lifetime, with the odds gradually accumulating against survival. It wasn't one dramatic life or death moment, but rather a continuous exposure to mortal risk, repeated with each pregnancy, with no good options to stop the cycle. So the next time someone refers to childbirth as natural and therefore safe, remember the 1 in 8 Viking women who died from this natural process. Remember the family plots with multiple generations of young women who died bearing children. Remember that our current maternal safety is a recent medical achievement, purchased through hard-won knowledge, not a natural state of human reproduction. We can scarcely imagine living with that level of risk as simply an accepted part of being a woman, but that was their reality, and the young female skeletons in cemetery after cemetery testify to the price they paid. Chapter 16. Pregnancy during raids. The Viking Age, raiding economy meant men regularly left for months-long expeditions, departing in spring and returning in fall if they returned at all. This created a predictable pattern. Women were often pregnant when men left and gave birth during their absence. The management of a farm, the protection of the household, the daily survival tasks, and the ordeal of childbirth all fell to women who had no choice but to handle everything alone, or with only children and elderly household members for help. This was pregnancy without partners, birth without the support that even Viking society nominally expected men to provide. Picture the timeline. Your husband and the other adult men from the settlement depart in April or May, taking the best ships and warriors for a raiding season that might last until September or October. You're 3 months pregnant when they leave. The farming, animal care, food preservation, and defence of the homestead are now entirely your responsibility. As summer progresses and your pregnancy advances, you're hauling water with a growing belly, grinding grain while fighting exhaustion, managing livestock while experiencing the physical strain of late pregnancy. And you're doing this knowing that when labour begins, likely in late summer or early fall, your husband won't be there. Neither will most of the adult men who might have provided any help or security. What made this truly brutal was the vulnerability it created during childbirth itself. In the best circumstances, Viking women gave birth attended by a midwife and female relatives. But when men were away raiding, the settlement population was reduced and help might not be available. Women sometimes gave birth alone or attended only by their young children, children who'd never witnessed birth before, children too young to provide meaningful help, children who would be traumatised by watching their mother suffer through labour without adult assistance. Archaeological evidence from runic inscriptions includes several stones, with prayers from women asking gods to bring their husbands home before the child came, desperate requests that reveal how frightening the prospect of solo childbirth was, even to women who lived in this culture. The saga literature contains references to births during raiding absences that suggest how common and difficult this pattern was. One saga mentions a woman who bore a son while her husband was in England, and when he returned the child was already walking, suggesting an absence of over a year, with the woman managing pregnancy, birth and infant care entirely alone. Another saga describes a woman who sent word to her husband that she'd borne twins in his absence, both living and asking his decision, revealing that, even for the critical exposure decision, women sometimes had to wait months for male authority to return and rule on the infant's fates. The casual mention of these scenarios suggests they were routine rather than exceptional. Archaeological evidence for this pattern appears in settlement remains showing seasonal occupation patterns. At some Viking Age farmsteads, researchers find evidence that main buildings were occupied year-round by women, children, and elderly, while men's activities show seasonal patterns consistent with raiding absences. Personal artifacts like weapons and trading goods show seasonal distribution patterns, suggesting men came and went while women remained continuously present. This residential archaeology confirms what the sagas describe. Women maintained the home base while men engaged in the mobile, violent wealth extraction economy that defined Viking culture. The psychological toll of pregnancy and birth during spousal absence added to the physical challenges. Modern pregnancy often involves partner support, attendance at appointments, help with tasks, presence during labour, shared responsibility. The Viking woman pregnant during raiding season had none of this. She managed everything alone, gave birth alone or nearly alone, and cared for the newborn alone while wondering if her husband would return at all. Some husbands died during raids, meaning women went through pregnancy, birth, and early infant care only to receive news that they were now widows responsible for everything permanently. It's hard not to think about modern birthing partners, the expected presence of spouses or support people during labour, versus the Viking woman labouring on her sleeping bench with only her frightened children present, her husband hundreds of miles away seeking plunder in foreign lands, her outcome entirely dependent on her own strength and luck. We can scarcely imagine that level of isolation during one of life's most vulnerable moments, but it was routine for Viking women whose reproductive cycles didn't align with their husbands' raiding schedules. Chapter 17. The Rape Pregnancy Problem. The Viking Age raiding culture, celebrated in popular media for its adventurous spirit and warrior ethos, had a dark foundation in systematic violence, including widespread sexual assault. Raiding parties routinely captured women from monasteries, villages, and towns across Europe for enslavement, ransom, or immediate assault. But sexual violence wasn't limited to raids on foreign lands. It occurred within Viking society as well. Enslaved women had no legal protection against their owners' sexual demands. Women in newly conquered settlements faced assault from settlers, and even free women had limited legal recourse against sexual violence. This created pregnancies that resulted from rape, pregnancies women had no choice but to carry in a society with no concept of reproductive rights or bodily autonomy. The scale of rape-related pregnancy in the Viking Age is impossible to quantify precisely, but we can infer its frequency from multiple sources. Law codes from the period address children born from what they term unwilling encounters, legal language that acknowledged sexual violence while often minimizing consequences for perpetrators. The laws focus primarily on inheritance and legitimacy questions, rather than on the violence against women or their right to refuse pregnancy. Enslaved women had zero legal protection. Their bodies were considered their owner's property, and any children born from forced sexual contact belonged to the owner as additional property. This created a system where rape wasn't a violation, but rather a form of property exploitation. What made this truly brutal was women's complete lack of agency in the aftermath. Modern discussions of reproductive rights include access to emergency contraception, abortion in cases of rape, and at minimum the acknowledgement that forced pregnancy is a violation of human rights. Viking women had none of this. Once pregnant from rape, they carried the pregnancy to term regardless of their wishes or the circumstances of conception. They gave birth to children conceived through violence, and then they raised these children in households where the father might be the owner who'd raped them, or where the child's parentage was known to result from assault, but this fact carried no social weight that protected the mother. The saga literature, written by men and focused on male concerns, rarely addresses this reality directly, but occasional references reveal the pattern. One saga mentions a thrall woman who bore her master's children, phrasing that presents sexual exploitation as routine household management rather than as violence. Another saga discusses inheritance disputes involving children born to thralls, with legal arguments about their status but no acknowledgement of the sexual violence that likely produced many of these children. The silence around women's experience of forced pregnancy is itself revealing. This wasn't considered worth discussing because it was simply accepted as how things worked. Archaeological evidence for rape-related pregnancy is indirect but suggestive. Genetic analysis of Viking Age populations shows admixture patterns consistent with systematic sexual exploitation. European genetic markers appearing in Scandinavian settlements, Scandinavian markers spreading across raiding territories, patterns suggesting forced reproduction rather than consensual mixing. At settlements in Iceland and other Viking colonies, skeletal analysis combined with genetic testing reveals populations that include women of clearly non-Scandinavian origin who bore children in these settlements, women who were likely captured, transported and forcibly impregnated. One particularly disturbing study of a Viking Age settlement in Scotland found multiple women buried there who genetic analysis revealed came from Ireland, with skeletal evidence suggesting they'd borne children at very young ages in the settlement. These weren't willing emigrants, but likely captured girls who were brought to Scotland and used for reproduction. The legal texts provide the clearest evidence of how systematised this violence was. Law codes specify that children born to enslaved women belong to the owner regardless of paternity, explicitly creating legal framework for rape as reproduction. Other laws address what happens when free women are raped, generally requiring the perpetrator to pay a fine to the woman's male guardian, rather than treating the act as a serious crime against the woman herself. The woman's own testimony carried less weight than male witnesses, meaning proving rape was difficult and punishment was minimal. This created a legal environment where sexual violence was treated as property damage or minor breach, rather than a serious violation of human dignity. For the individual woman experiencing forced pregnancy, the trauma compounded continuously. The initial assault, the realization of pregnancy, the months of carrying a child conceived through violence, the pain of childbirth, bringing that child into the world, the years of raising a child while remembering their conception. This was lifelong trauma inflicted through reproductive exploitation. And the society offered no recognition of this harm, no support for the violated women, no justice for the violence. The rape victim was expected to bear and raise the child with the same dedication as any mother, with her violation treated as irrelevant to her duties. So the next time someone romanticizes Viking society's strength or independence, remember the enslaved woman raped by her owner, carrying the resulting pregnancy with no rights and no recourse, birthing a child who would also be the owner's property, her body used as a reproduction tool in a system that treated this as completely normal. We can scarcely imagine a society where reproductive violation was so thoroughly systematized and legally sanctioned, but that was their reality. And the genetic evidence of forced admixture across Viking territories testifies to how widespread it was. Chapter 18, Fertility Pressure and Shame. In Viking society, a woman's primary value was defined by her ability to produce children, particularly sons who could inherit property, provide labour, and continue the family line. This created intense social pressure on women to prove their fertility quickly after marriage, and to continue bearing children throughout their reproductive years. Infertility, whether actual biological inability to conceive or simply delayed conception, carried profound shame and potentially devastating social consequences. Women who didn't produce children fast enough or at all faced divorce, loss of status, and social isolation in a culture that measured female worth primarily through reproductive output. The pressure began immediately upon marriage. Marriages in Viking society were primarily economic and reproductive arrangements, alliances between families that were validated through the production of children. A marriage that didn't quickly produce offspring was considered problematic, and the fault was automatically assumed to be the woman's. Modern reproductive medicine understands that infertility can result from male factors, female factors, or both. But Viking culture had no such understanding. If a couple didn't conceive, the woman was infertile, the woman was failing her primary purpose, and the woman faced consequences. the man might divorce her and marry someone else who would prove more fertile, regardless of whether he was actually the source of the fertility problem. What made this truly brutal was the complete lack of support or understanding for women struggling with infertility. Modern women experiencing fertility challenges have access to medical evaluation, treatment options, emotional support, and at least the acknowledgement that infertility is a medical condition rather than a moral failing. Viking women had none of this. Infertility was seen as either divine disfavour, the gods refusing to bless the woman with children, or as some inherent defect in the woman herself. There was no investigation of cause, no treatment beyond desperate appeals to Freya, and folk remedies of questionable efficacy, and no social acceptance of childless women as complete members of society. The saga literature reflects the social weight of fertility with disturbing consistency. Women are valued and described primarily through their reproductive success. She bore 5 strong sons, or she was a good wife and bore many children. Conversely, infertility is mentioned as a catastrophic failure. One saga describes a woman who bore no children in 3 years of marriage and was sent back to her father's house in shame. Another mentions that a divorced woman returned to her family bearing the shame of barrenness, with the divorce being presented as justified and the woman's infertility as warranting social disgrace. The casual acceptance of these divorces and the assignment of shame entirely to the woman reveals how thoroughly reproductive capacity defined female value. Archaeological evidence for fertility-focused pressure appears in burial goods and religious artefacts. Women's graves often contain items researchers interpret as fertility amulets, carved figures, stones with runic inscriptions asking for children, representations of pregnant women or nursing mothers. The presence of these items across multiple burials suggests widespread anxiety about fertility and desperate attempts to ensure reproductive success. At one gravesite in Sweden, researchers found a woman buried with 3 different carved fertility figures and a stone inscribed with prayers to Freya, suggesting she'd carried these through life, perhaps through years of failed attempts to conceive, and they'd been buried with her as acknowledgement of her struggle. The grave goods tell a story of a woman whose life was dominated by fertility anxiety. Law codes also reveal the consequences of infertility. Provisions specify that failure to produce children within certain timeframes could be grounds for divorce, with the woman sent back to her birth family without the bride price that would normally be returned in divorce. This meant infertile women lost both their marriages and the economic security that marriage provided, returning to their families as burdens rather than valued members. Some law codes specify that a woman who proves barren could be divorced without any financial obligation to her or her family, treating infertility as a breach of the marriage contract that voided the husband's obligations. For women in this situation, infertility meant not just personal sadness but complete social and economic devastation. The cruelty of this system becomes even clearer when we consider cases of secondary infertility, women who bore children successfully and then stopped conceiving. Modern medicine recognises numerous causes for secondary infertility, many of them treatable. But Viking women who bore 1 or 2 children and then didn't conceive again face the same shame and consequences as women who'd never conceived. One saga mentions a woman who bore 2 sons, and then no more children came, and her husband took a second wife. The casual notation of acquiring a second wife, effectively declaring the first wife's reproductive usefulness ended, reveals how thoroughly women's value was tied to continuous fertility rather than to any other attribute or previous contribution. There's a particular cruelty to this fertility pressure when combined with other aspects of Viking pregnancy we've discussed. Women who bore multiple children risked their lives, damaged their bodies permanently, and faced high odds of watching those children die. Yet women who didn't, or couldn't bear children, faced social catastrophe. The system punished women whether they succeeded or failed at the reproductive mandate, Success meant physical destruction, failure meant social destruction. It's hard not to think about modern understanding that reproductive capacity doesn't define human worth, that infertility is a medical condition deserving of compassion rather than shame, that women's value extends far beyond their ability to bear children. The Viking woman struggling with infertility had none of this understanding. She had only shame, divorce, and the knowledge that her society considered her fundamentally failed. We can scarcely imagine measuring a person's entire worth by one biological capacity, but that was their reality, and the divorced women sent home in shame testify to the price of failing to meet this single crushing expectation. Chapter 19. The twin death rate. Modern obstetrics treats twin pregnancy as higher risk but manageable, with proper prenatal care and delivery planning. Viking Age twin pregnancy was essentially a death sentence, for at least one twin, often both, sometimes the mother as well. The biological demands of supporting two fetuses on inadequate maternal nutrition, the complications of twin delivery without medical intervention, and the economic impossibility of supporting two additional infants simultaneously created a perfect storm of mortality that made twin survival exceptionally rare. Archaeological evidence suggests the twin death rate was catastrophically high, with most twin pregnancies ending in at least one death and many ending in 3. The biological challenges of twin pregnancy began in the womb. A singleton pregnancy already strained a Viking woman's inadequate nutrition to dangerous levels, as we've discussed. Twin pregnancy doubled those demands, 2 fetuses competing for limited nutrients, 2 sets of bones pulling calcium from the mother's skeleton, 2 growing bodies requiring protein the mother wasn't receiving. The result was predictable. Twins were born significantly smaller and weaker than singletons, often premature, frequently with developmental problems that made survival unlikely even if they survived delivery. The mother's body, already depleted by the double demand, faced even higher risks of complications during and after delivery. What made twin births truly brutal was the delivery complications they created. Twins could present in multiple configurations, both head first, and one breech, both breech or transverse positioning. Modern obstetrics handles these through careful monitoring and often caesarean delivery. Viking midwives had only their hands and prayers. If the first twin delivered successfully, the mother was already exhausted when facing delivery of the second twin. If positioning was problematic, breech or transverse, each twin multiplied the danger exponentially. The saga literature includes references to difficult births of multiple children that almost certainly describe twin deliveries that went catastrophically wrong, with one or both babies dying in delivery, or the mother dying from the prolonged trauma of delivering 2 babies in difficult positions. The archaeological evidence for twin death appears in burial patterns that are both subtle and disturbing. Researchers occasionally find graves with paired infant burials, 2 tiny skeletons interred together or in very close proximity, suggesting twins who died at or near birth. At one excavation in Denmark, archaeologists found a grave containing a young woman buried with 2 newborn skeletons positioned at her sides, interpreted as a mother who died in or shortly after a twin delivery, buried with both babies who also failed to survive. The positioning, all 3 bodies in one grave, tells a story of a birth that killed everyone involved, a triple tragedy that was devastating yet common enough that it didn't warrant exceptional burial treatment. Beyond the immediate survival challenges, twins who did survive birth faced an even grimmer obstacle, the exposure decision. Resources that could barely support 1 additional infant couldn't possibly support 2. Fathers faced an impossible economic calculation: keep both twins and risk the household's survival, keep one and expose the other, or expose both and avoid the risk entirely. The saga literature suggests that twin exposure was common, possibly even expected. One saga mentions twins being born and the father choosing to keep only the stronger one, with the weaker twin presumably left outside. Another reference is twin girls born in winter, neither kept, suggesting both were exposed due to resource scarcity and gender preference. The casual notation of these decisions reveals how normalised selective or complete twin infanticide had become. Law codes sometimes addressed twin situations specifically, suggesting they were frequent enough to require legal framework. Some laws specify that in twin births, the father must choose within the first hours which infants to accept or reject, suggesting the decision had to be made quickly before social pressure to keep both babies could develop. Other laws address inheritance issues for surviving twins, suggesting some twins did survive, but that this was rare enough to warrant special legal consideration. The existence of specific legal provisions for twins indicates both that twin births occurred regularly, and that their survival was unusual enough to require specific rules. The long-term evidence for twin survival is telling in its scarcity. When researchers analyse skeletal remains across Viking Age burial grounds, they rarely find evidence of individuals who are part of a twin pregnancy that both survived to adulthood. Bone development markers that might indicate twin gestation are uncommon in adult remains, suggesting most twins who survived birth didn't survive childhood. At burial sites with extensive skeletal analysis, including developmental markers, researchers have identified only a handful of possible surviving twins among hundreds or thousands of burials examined. This suggests a twin survival rate so low as to be exceptional rather than rare. There's a particular horror to the twin reality when we consider the mother's perspective. She endured 9 months of especially difficult pregnancy, her body strained by double demands. She survived a dangerous twin delivery that might have killed her, and then she watched as her husband looked at the 2 babies she had laboured to bring into the world and decided whether either or both deserved to live. If one twin was exposed, she nursed the survivor knowing its sibling had been left in the cold. If both were exposed, she had endured all that suffering for nothing. If both survived, the rarest outcome, she knew she'd be supporting 2 infants with resources inadequate for one, possibly condemning other household members to deprivation. So the next time you see modern twin photography celebrating matched babies in cute outfits, remember the Viking mother who delivered twins and watched her husband carry one or both outside to die. Her body's double burden ending in calculated infanticide that was considered rational resource management. We can scarcely imagine that calculus, but for Viking families it was simply math, and the paired infant graves testify to how often the calculation ended in death. Chapter 20. Pregnancy-related disabilities. For women who survived pregnancy and childbirth, survival didn't always mean return to normal function. Birth-related injuries created permanent disabilities that affected women for the rest of their lives, often decades of suffering from damage sustained during hours of delivery. These injuries, which modern obstetrics can often prevent or repair, were simply endured in the Viking Age with no treatment, no surgical intervention, no recognition that they represented preventable medical problems rather than inevitable consequences of reproduction. Women lived with incontinence, prolapse, chronic pain, mobility limitations and other disabilities that marked them as having fulfilled their reproductive purpose at the cost of their physical integrity. The most common serious birth injury was pelvic floor damage, tears in the muscles, connective tissue, and sometimes the fascia between the vaginal wall and bladder or rectum. In severe cases, this created fistulas, abnormal connections between the birth canal and bladder or rectum that caused constant leakage of urine or feces. Modern women with these injuries receive surgical repair and pelvic floor physical therapy. Viking women with fistulas simply lived with them, experiencing constant wetness, odour, and social stigma for conditions they couldn't control. The archaeological record can't directly preserve soft tissue injuries, but occasional skeletal evidence hints at these problems: pelvic fractures and deformities suggesting traumatic deliveries, hip and spine damage consistent with altered gait patterns that would result from severe pelvic floor injury. What made these disabilities truly brutal was their permanence and invisibility. A woman who suffered severe tearing during delivery might recover from the immediate trauma but discover she could no longer control her bladder or bowel. This wasn't a temporary postpartum issue but a permanent disability that would affect her for 30, 40, 50 years if she lived that long. She'd work the farm while leaking urine. She'd sleep in the longhouse while managing bowel incontinence. She'd participate in community life carrying the smell and stigma of constant leakage. And because these were women's problems related to childbirth, they weren't discussed openly, weren't considered worthy of medical attention, even if treatment had existed, and was simply endured in silence and shame. The saga literature never directly describes these disabilities, because they fell into the category of things too intimate and female-focused for male saga writers to address. But occasional oblique references hint at the reality. Phrases like, "she never walked well after her last birthing," or "she kept to herself after bearing children," might reference the mobility issues and social withdrawal that severe birth injuries created. One saga mentions a woman who died young though she bore no more children after her third birthing, possibly referencing infection or complications from untreated birth injury that eventually proved fatal even years after the traumatic delivery. The silence around these issues in the written record doesn't mean they didn't exist. It means they were considered too mundane and too female to warrant male attention. Archaeological evidence for birth-related disabilities appears in skeletal analysis that reveals patterns of secondary damage. Women's skeletons sometimes show hip degeneration, spinal abnormalities, and gait-related wear patterns that suggest they walked or moved differently after multiple births, consistent with nerve damage, pelvic floor injury, or structural damage from delivery. At one burial site, researchers examined a woman who died in her early 40s, with skeletal evidence of having borne multiple children and significant hip dysplasia that appeared to have developed during her reproductive years, possibly related to pelvic trauma from difficult deliveries that altered her skeletal alignment and caused degenerative joint disease. She'd lived perhaps 2 decades with this disability, her skeleton showing the cumulative damage of years of altered movement patterns. Nerve damage was another permanent disability that birth could inflict. Prolonged labour with the baby's head putting pressure on pelvic nerves could cause permanent loss of sensation or motor control in the legs, feet or pelvic region. Modern obstetrics tries to avoid prolonged second-stage labour, partly to prevent this nerve damage. Viking women who laboured for many hours or days might sustain nerve injuries that left them with foot drop, difficulty walking, chronic pain, or loss of sexual function. These injuries left no direct archaeological evidence, but would have profoundly affected women's lives. A woman with foot drop from nerve damage would struggle with farm work, would tire more easily, would be seen as weak or lazy despite working with a disability. The lack of medical understanding meant these injuries weren't recognised as birth-related, but might be attributed to the woman's personal weakness or character flaws. Uterine prolapse, where damaged pelvic floor allows the uterus to descend into or out of the vaginal canal, created a particularly miserable permanent condition. Women with severe prolapse experienced a sensation of something protruding from their bodies, difficulty walking, chronic back pain, and inability to work effectively. Modern treatment includes pessaries or surgical repair. Viking women had neither. One reference from later medieval texts describing conditions inherited from earlier practices mentions women using pessaries made from wool or cloth, suggesting attempts to manage prolapse without understanding the underlying anatomy. These makeshift devices probably caused additional problems, infection, irritation, further trauma, while providing minimal relief. There's a particular cruelty to pregnancy-related disabilities when we consider them comprehensively. Women were pressured to bear many children, with fertility defining their worth. Each pregnancy and birth increased the risk of permanent injury. And then the disabilities resulting from fulfilling society's reproductive demands made women less capable of fulfilling their other expected roles: farm work, household management, future pregnancies. The system that valued women primarily for reproduction also destroyed their bodies through reproduction, creating disabled women who were then devalued for the disabilities caused by the very things society demanded of them. It's hard not to think about modern obstetric care, the attention to preventing birth injuries, the surgical repairs available, the physical therapy for recovery, the recognition that these are medical problems deserving of treatment. The Viking woman with a fistula leaking constantly, with nerve damage limiting her mobility, with prolapse making every step painful, had none of this. She simply lived with it. Decades of disability and silence, her body permanently marked by the price of reproduction. We can scarcely imagine living with these conditions untreated, but that was their reality, and the skeletal evidence of secondary gait damage testifies to how many women spent decades of their lives coping with birth injuries that destroyed their physical function. Chapter 21. The Religious Fatalism. In attempting to make sense of the random cruelty of pregnancy outcomes, why some women survived while others died, why some babies lived while others were stillborn, why infections claimed some mothers but spared others, Viking society turned to religious explanation. The gods decided. Freya blessed some women with easy births and healthy children, while withholding favour from others. This fate-based worldview provided psychological comfort and narrative coherence, but also created a dangerous fatalism that discouraged any attempt to improve conditions or techniques. If outcomes were predetermined by divine will, why bother trying to change anything? The concept of fate, word in Old Norse, permeated Viking worldview, but its application to pregnancy was particularly powerful because pregnancy outcomes seemed so arbitrary and unpredictable. Two women of similar age and health might have radically different experiences, one delivering easily and recovering quickly, another dying in agony from complications. Without understanding the actual medical factors involved, attributing results to divine decision made intuitive sense. Freya, the goddess associated with fertility, love and cedar magic, was believed to hold the power over pregnancy outcomes. Women prayed to her, made offerings, wore amulets in her honour, hoping to earn divine favour that would ensure survival. When things went well, Freya had blessed them. When things went wrong, she'd withheld her favour, or the Norns, the fate weavers, had decreed death. What made this religious framework truly problematic was how it discouraged practical intervention or improvement. If a particular birthing technique seemed to help, but women sometimes died anyway, that was evidence that technique didn't matter. Only fate mattered. If one midwife had better outcomes than another, that was attributed to her having divine favour, rather than to any difference in skill or knowledge. The lack of systematic observation, the absence of any framework for understanding cause and effect in medical terms, meant that knowledge didn't accumulate in useful ways. Each generation of women faced pregnancy with essentially the same techniques, same risks, same mortality rates as the generation before, because the prevailing explanation for outcomes was divine will rather than medical factors. Archaeological evidence for religious approaches to pregnancy appears throughout Viking Age material culture. Women's graves contain fertility amulets, carved figures of pregnant women, stones inscribed with prayers or protective runes. These weren't decorative but functional, tools for invoking divine protection against the very real dangers of pregnancy and childbirth. At excavations of settlement sites, researchers have found small carved figures and stones with fertility symbols in domestic contexts, suggesting these objects were part of daily life rather than just burial goods. One particularly poignant find from a Norwegian farmstead included a small carved wooden figure of a woman with obviously pregnant belly, worn smooth from handling, discovered near a sleeping bench where births would have occurred. This object had been touched, held, prayed over by how many women facing labour, how many of them survived, and how many died despite the prayers. The saga literature reflects religious fatalism consistently when addressing pregnancy outcomes. Deaths are attributed to the will of the Norns, or described as fate that couldn't be changed. One saga mentions a woman who made all proper offerings to Freya but died birthing nonetheless, the phrasing suggesting that religious devotion should have protected her, but fate overruled even divine favour. Another describes a difficult birth where they called on Freya but she answered not, treating divine silence as the cause of poor outcome rather than considering medical factors. This framework made sense within their worldview, but meant no systematic attempt to improve birthing practices or understand what actually helped versus what didn't. The fatalism extended to child survival as well. Parents who lost children attributed deaths to divine will rather than to preventable factors like inadequate nutrition, exposure to cold, or infection. This acceptance, while psychologically protective in the face of common loss, also meant no systematic effort to reduce infant mortality through practical interventions. The modern concept that we can and should try to improve health outcomes through systematic observation and intervention didn't exist. Outcomes simply were what they were, determined by powers beyond human control or understanding. There's a particular sadness to the religious artifacts found in women's graves, the amulets and prayers that didn't work, the divine protection that failed, the offerings made to gods who didn't intervene. These weren't failures of faith, but rather limitations of a worldview that attributed to supernatural forces what we now understand as medical problems with medical solutions. The Viking woman praying to Freya during labour wasn't wrong to seek help beyond herself. She simply lived in a time when that supernatural help was the only intervention available. So the next time you encounter religious explanations for health outcomes, remember the Viking women whose survival depended on divine favour rather than medical care, whose prayers went unanswered not because the gods were cruel, but because the problems were biological, and the solutions were centuries away from discovery. We can scarcely imagine facing life-threatening medical events with only prayer as intervention, but that was their reality, and the amulets buried with dead mothers testify to how often faith alone wasn't enough. Chapter 22. Slave Women's Pregnancy. Everything we've discussed about Viking pregnancy becomes exponentially worse when we examine the experience of enslaved women, thralls in Old Norse terminology. These women, captured in raids or born into slavery, had absolutely no bodily autonomy, no legal protection, no rights regarding their own reproduction. Slave women's pregnancies resulted from systematic rape by their owners, their bodies used as reproduction machines to create more property for the master. Their children were born into slavery, could be sold away immediately, could be killed at the owner's whim. This was pregnancy at its most brutal. Reproduction as pure exploitation with no pretense of consent, partnership, or maternal rights. The scale of sexual slavery in Viking Age society was substantial. Raiding economy depended partly on slave capture. Thousands of people, predominantly women, were taken from Britain, Ireland, the Frankish territories, and Slavic regions, transported to Scandinavia or Viking colonies, and put to work. Female slaves performed agricultural labour, textile production, food preparation, and sexual service. The law codes make clear that owners had complete sexual access to their female slaves. This wasn't considered rape in legal terms because slaves weren't considered to have rights that could be violated. A slave woman's body belonged to her owner as completely as his livestock or tools, and he could use her for reproduction as he used his animals for breeding. What made this truly brutal was the deliberate nature of slave reproduction. Owners didn't just sexually exploit slave women, they deliberately impregnated them to produce more slaves. A child born to a slave woman was automatically a slave belonging to the mother's owner, creating economic incentive for forced pregnancy. Law codes specify ownership of slave children, inheritance of slaves, and procedures for selling slave offspring. All of this creating legal framework for systematic reproductive exploitation. Slave women had no say in whether they became pregnant, no protection during pregnancy, no rights regarding their children's fate. They were breeding stock, their pregnancies managed for the owner's economic benefit rather than for any concern about their well-being or the children's welfare. The saga literature, when it mentions slaves at all, reflects this brutal system with disturbing casualness. References to thrall women who bore their masters' children appear without moral commentary, presented as routine household management. One saga mentions a man who got 3 sons on his thrall women, 2 of whom he kept and 1 he sold, treating the children as commodities to be managed based on economic calculation, with no consideration of the mothers who'd carried and birthed them. Another describes how a household managed its labour force. He had 6 thralls, 3 women who worked the dairy and bore children when he required. The phrasing, when he required, makes explicit that pregnancy wasn't something that happened to these women, but something done to them at the owner's decision. Archaeological evidence for slave women's pregnancies appears in burial patterns and skeletal analysis. Slaves were generally buried separately from free people, often without grave goods, in unmarked locations. But some burial sites reveal women of clearly non-Scandinavian origin who died young with skeletal evidence of multiple pregnancies and poor nutrition, patterns suggesting enslaved women worked to death while being used for reproduction. Genetic analysis of Viking Age populations shows admixture patterns consistent with systematic sexual exploitation, captured women bearing children by their captors, with genetic markers from across Europe appearing in Scandinavian populations. At some settlement sites, researchers find graves of young women with infant burials nearby, showing non-local bone chemistry suggesting these women were brought from elsewhere, probably as slaves, bore children, and died young under brutal conditions. The treatment of slave women during pregnancy and childbirth added additional cruelty to already horrific circumstances. Pregnant slave women received no reduction in work demands, no special nutrition, no particular care. They worked until labour began, delivered their babies with minimal assistance, and returned to work as soon as physically possible. If complications arose, the owner decided whether providing help was economically justified. Slaves were property, and the calculation was whether the woman's labour value justified whatever intervention might be available. Some owners probably provided basic care to protect their investment. Others likely let sick or injured slave women die rather than expending resources on them. The slaves had no agency in these decisions and no recourse regardless of outcome. Children born to enslaved mothers faced a particularly grim reality. They could be kept and raised as the household slaves. They could be sold immediately or in childhood, taken from their mothers at the owner's convenience. They could be killed. Law codes specify that owners had the right to decide whether slave infants lived or died, with no legal protection for children born into slavery. For slave mothers, pregnancy meant enduring 9 months of physical demand, surviving the dangers of childbirth, and then facing the possibility that the child would be taken away or killed. The psychological torture of this, being forced to carry pregnancies, deliver children, and then have those children treated as disposable property, is almost impossible to comprehend. There's a particular horror to slave pregnancy that distinguishes it from even the brutal experiences of free Viking women. Free women at least had some social recognition of their suffering, some status derived from bearing children, some legal protection, however inadequate. Slave women had nothing. Their bodies were used for reproduction without consent. Their children were property, not family. Their pregnancies served only their oppressors' economic interests. So the next time someone romanticizes Viking society or portrays it as egalitarian or progressive, remember the enslaved women raped systematically for reproduction, the children born into slavery and separated from their mothers at owners' whim, the genetic evidence of forced pregnancies spread across Viking territories. We can scarcely imagine that level of reproductive exploitation, but it was fundamental to Viking economy, and the non-Scandinavian genetic markers in Viking Age populations testify to how systematically these women's bodies were used for reproduction against their will. Chapter 23. The Age Factor. Modern understanding of adolescent development recognises that girls in their early teens are physically and psychologically unready for pregnancy. Their bodies are still developing, their pelvises haven't reached adult size, their bone density is still accumulating. Current medical recommendations advise delaying pregnancy until at least late teens or early 20s, when physical maturity reduces risks. Viking society had no such understanding or concern. Girls were considered marriageable and suitable for pregnancy as soon as menarche occurred, typically around ages 12 to 14. This meant children, girls whose bodies were fundamentally unprepared, being impregnated and forced to endure pregnancy and childbirth, with exponentially higher death rates than adult women. The skeletal evidence for adolescent pregnancy in the Viking Age is disturbing and unambiguous. When bioarchaeologists analyse female remains, they can determine approximate age at death through various markers, including dental development, epiphyseal fusion, and bone density. They can also identify whether a woman bore children through pelvic markers and other skeletal changes that pregnancy creates. At multiple Viking Age burial sites, researchers have found skeletons of girls aged approximately 13 to 16, with clear evidence of pregnancy or childbirth. The most heartbreaking finds are graves of teenage girls buried with fetal or newborn remains, adolescents who died in pregnancy or childbirth, their underdeveloped bodies unable to handle the biological demands placed on them. What made adolescent pregnancy truly brutal was the physical reality of birth for girls with incompletely developed pelvises. The birth canal must be large enough to accommodate a baby's head, the largest and least compressible part. Adult women's pelvises have completed the bone growth and reshaping that creates adequate space for birth. Adolescent girls' pelvises are still developing. They're narrower, the angles aren't optimal, the bone structure isn't mature. Attempting to deliver a baby through an adolescent pelvis created nightmarish complications. Prolonged labour as the baby couldn't descend properly. Severe tearing as tissue was forced beyond its capacity. Obstructed labour where the baby literally couldn't fit through the birth canal, resulting in death of both mother and child after hours or days of suffering. The statistics from modern developing countries where child marriage still occurs show that girls under 15 are 5 times more likely to die in childbirth than women in their 20s. Viking adolescents faced similar or worse odds. The saga literature occasionally references very young brides in ways that reveal how normalised child marriage and pregnancy were. One saga mentions a girl married at 13 winters and bore her first child before 14 winters, stating this as simple fact without any suggestion that this was problematic. Another describes a marriage arrangement where the bride was promised at 12 winters, married at 13, a mother at 14. The compressed timeline presented as efficient family planning rather than as child abuse. The sagas focus on male exploits and typically mention women only in relation to marriages and births, but when they do, the ages referenced suggest routine pregnancy of girls who were children by modern standards. Law codes from the period don't specify minimum marriage age in most cases, suggesting no legal protection against extremely early marriage and pregnancy. Some later laws influenced by Christian contacts specify girls should be at least 12 before marriage, framing this as a minimum age rather than acknowledging that even 12 is far too young for pregnancy. The absence of age restrictions in earlier law codes suggests girls could be married even younger if families agreed to the arrangement. The economic and political benefits of marriage alliances outweighed any concern for girls' physical readiness for reproduction. Archaeological evidence of adolescent maternal death appears with disturbing frequency. At a burial ground in Denmark, researchers analysing female remains found multiple adolescent girls who died with evidence of pregnancy or recent childbirth. One particularly tragic grave contained a girl estimated at 14-15 years old, buried with a newborn. Both had died, likely in the delivery that neither survived. The girl's pelvis showed evidence of traumatic birth injury, suggesting obstructed labour that eventually killed both mother and child. Her skeleton also showed she was still actively growing at death. Her long bone epiphyses weren't fully fused, indicating she hadn't reached physical maturity when pregnancy occurred. This wasn't rare misfortune, but rather predictable outcome of forcing children to attempt pregnancy before their bodies were ready. The long-term health consequences for adolescent girls who survived first pregnancies were severe. Early pregnancy before physical maturity is associated with stunted growth. The girl's body diverts resources to the pregnancy that should have gone to her own continued development. Multiple studies of historical populations with early marriage patterns show women who bore children in early teens ended up shorter, weaker, and more prone to later health problems than women who delayed first pregnancy. Viking girls who became pregnant at 13 or 14 and survived probably experienced permanent developmental impairment, their adult bodies smaller and weaker than they should have been because pregnancy interrupted their growth. There's a particular cruelty to adolescent pregnancy that combines physical danger with psychological trauma. These weren't women who'd reached maturity and understood what pregnancy meant. They were children who might not even understand reproduction when they were married off and impregnated. The physical pain of childbirth would be compounded by terror and confusion from a child who didn't comprehend what was happening to her body. And if she survived, she'd face years of raising a child while still being a child herself, her own adolescence stolen by forced early reproduction. So the next time you hear someone discuss teenage pregnancy as a choice, or historical early marriage as traditional, remember the 14-year-old Viking girl dying in obstructed labour because her pelvis wasn't large enough to deliver a baby, her body and her babies both destroyed by pregnancy that occurred years before. She was physically ready. We can scarcely imagine a society that considered this acceptable, but the skeletal evidence of dead adolescent mothers testifies to how routine it was. Chapter 24. Postpartum Depression in Silence. Modern medicine recognises postpartum depression and postpartum psychosis as serious medical conditions, affecting roughly 10 to 15% of mothers after delivery. Conditions caused by hormonal changes, physical stress, and psychological factors that require treatment to prevent suffering and potential harm. Viking Age society had no medical framework for understanding mental health conditions, no recognition that postpartum mood disorders were biological rather than personal failings, and no treatment beyond folk remedies and prayers. Women suffering postpartum depression endured it in silence and shame, their suffering invisible or attributed to personal weakness or spiritual attack. Women experiencing postpartum psychosis, a rarer but more dangerous condition involving delusions and hallucinations, faced even worse outcomes, potentially being killed or abandoned as mad or possessed. The biological basis for postpartum mood disorders, dramatic hormonal shifts after delivery, combined with physical exhaustion, pain, and the stress of caring for a newborn, would have been universal across human history. Viking women experienced the same biological triggers that cause postpartum depression in modern women, but without medical understanding of mood disorders, without recognition that depression could have external biological causes rather than being a personal moral failing, postpartum depression was simply unnamed suffering. A woman who couldn't bond with her baby, who felt overwhelming sadness and anxiety, who struggled to care for herself and the infant, who had thoughts of harming herself. These symptoms would be interpreted as character weakness, divine punishment, or spiritual attack rather than as treatable medical condition. What made postpartum mental health suffering truly brutal in the Viking Age was the complete absence of support or treatment. Modern postpartum depression treatment includes therapy, medication, and social support, with explicit recognition that this is a medical condition, not the mother's fault. Viking women with postpartum depression had none of this. They were expected to immediately resume full household responsibilities, caring for the newborn, managing household work, maintaining food production, while suffering untreated depression. The expectation was that having a baby should be joyful, and failure to feel joy was personal failing. Women who struggled were shamed for their weakness, rather than supported in recovery. The saga literature rarely addresses women's internal emotional states, but occasional references hint at postpartum mental health suffering. Phrases like, "she was never the same after birthing," or "took to melancholy after bearing her child," might reference postpartum depression. One saga mentions a woman who bore a son and refused to nurse him, saying he brought darkness, possibly describing postpartum depression severe enough to interfere with infant care, or possibly early postpartum psychosis. Another references a woman who became strange in her thinking after birthing and died within the year, possibly describing postpartum depression leading to suicide, though the saga doesn't state this explicitly. The vague, uncomfortable phrasing around these references suggests mental health suffering was recognised but not understood, and carried significant shame. Postpartum psychosis, the more severe but rarer condition involving delusions, hallucinations, and sometimes violence, would have been particularly terrifying in a culture without psychiatric framework. Modern medicine recognises postpartum psychosis as a medical emergency, requiring immediate treatment to protect both mother and baby. Viking society would have interpreted these symptoms as demonic possession, divine curse, or madness. A woman experiencing postpartum psychosis might hear voices, believe her baby was evil or inhuman, become violently agitated or completely withdrawn. In a longhouse with no privacy, these symptoms would be witnessed by everyone. The responses: binding the woman, isolating her, attempting spiritual cleansing, potentially killing her as possessed, would add trauma to already desperate medical condition. Archaeological evidence for postpartum mental health suffering is essentially impossible to find directly. Mental illness doesn't leave marks on bone, and women who died from suicide or were killed as mad wouldn't necessarily have burials indicating cause of death. But indirect evidence might exist in unusual burial patterns for women who died shortly after giving birth. At some excavation sites, researchers have found women buried outside normal cemetery areas, buried without usual grave goods, or buried in positions suggesting hasty or shameful interment. Some of these might represent women who died by suicide or who were killed just abandoned due to mental illness, including postpartum psychosis. The stigma around mental illness and suicide would have meant these women's burials didn't follow normal patterns, potentially explaining anomalous female burials at postpartum age. The lack of recognition or treatment meant women either recovered on their own, as most postpartum depression eventually resolves even without treatment, though recovery is longer and more painful, or they died, either from suicide or from being killed, abandoned when their condition was interpreted as demonic possession. The women who recovered carried the experience in silence, with no framework for understanding what they'd been through, and no validation that their suffering was real and biologically based. The shame of having felt wrong things after childbirth, of having struggled when they should have been joyful, became another hidden trauma layered on top of the physical trauma of pregnancy and birth. There's a particular cruelty to postpartum mental health suffering in a culture with no understanding of it. Modern women with postpartum depression can be told, "This is a medical condition. It's not your fault. It's treatable. You'll recover." This validation, combined with treatment, makes a profound difference. Viking women with postpartum depression had only their own perceived failing, the shame of not feeling what they were supposed to feel, and the expectation to function normally despite debilitating depression. So the next time you hear someone discuss postpartum mental health, remember the Viking women suffering depression in silence, the mothers who couldn't bond with their babies and blame themselves rather than understanding the biological causes, the women experiencing psychosis who were killed or abandoned as possessed by evil spirits. We can scarcely imagine facing severe depression or psychosis without any recognition that these are medical conditions deserving of treatment, but that was their reality. And the occasional saga reference to women who went strange after birthing hints at suffering that had no name and no help. Chapter 25. The cumulative trauma. We've examined 24 specific aspects of Viking Age pregnancy, each chapter revealing another dimension of suffering, danger, or exploitation. Now, for our final chapter, we need to step back and consider the cumulative effect, what it meant to be a woman in Viking society, knowing from childhood that your future held repeated pregnancy, that each pregnancy might kill you, that surviving meant years of repeated trauma as you bore and often buried children, that your body would be used up by reproductive demands until you died young, or lived on as a broken physical remnant. This wasn't one tragedy, but an entire life structure built around women's reproductive exploitation. The cumulative weight of this reality shaped everything about how Viking women experienced their lives. Consider the timeline of a typical Viking woman's reproductive life. Menarche around age 12-13, married shortly after, often within a year, first pregnancy by age 14 or 15, with the exponentially higher dangers that early pregnancy entailed. If she survived, and many didn't, she'd be pregnant again within a year or two, her body given minimal time to recover before the next pregnancy. This cycle would continue through her 20s and 30s. Pregnancy, birth, brief recovery, pregnancy again, until she either died from one of the many pregnancy-related causes we've discussed, or reached menopause around age 40-45 if she survived that long. A woman who bore 8 children over 20 years experienced approximately 72 months of pregnancy, 6 full years of her life spent gestating, plus the countless hours of labour, the weeks of postpartum recovery, the years of nursing. Nearly a quarter of her adult life was spent, pregnant with all the attendant risks and suffering each pregnancy brought. The physical toll was cumulative and irreversible. Each pregnancy leached calcium from her bones, depleted her nutritional reserves, stressed her cardiovascular system, and risked permanent injury during delivery. By age 30, a woman who'd borne 5 children had a body showing damage equivalent to someone decades older. Osteoporosis, dental loss, pelvic damage, spinal compression. By age 40, if she survived, she was likely physically broken, unable to work as hard as she once had, possibly disabled by birth injuries, certainly marked by the years of reproductive demands. The skeletal evidence shows this progression with disturbing clarity. Young women's bones look age-appropriate, but women who live through multiple pregnancies and into their late 30s show skeletal damage far beyond their chronological years. The psychological toll was equally cumulative, though less archaeologically visible. A woman who bore 8 children and buried 4 didn't just experience 4 discrete losses. She accumulated trauma and grief that compounded with each loss. The emotional protective mechanisms, not naming babies immediately, not investing too deeply in newborns, maintaining emotional distance from pregnancy, were necessary for psychological survival, but also represented a kind of damage, a warping of natural parental bonding in response to unbearable statistical reality. The chronic anxiety of knowing each pregnancy might kill you, the grief of repeated child loss, the helplessness of having no control over your own reproduction, the shame of infertility or postpartum depression, all of this accumulated over years into psychological burden that had no outlet or recognition. The social isolation of women's reproductive experiences created additional trauma. We've discussed the literal isolation of postpartum quarantine, but there was also the broader isolation of women's suffering being invisible to the male-dominated saga literature, unworthy of legal attention, and simply accepted as the unremarkable cost of being female. Women experienced these traumas together, attending each other's labours, watching each other die, burying each other's children, but their shared suffering existed in a separate sphere from the male world of warfare, law, and saga-worthy deeds. The silence around women's reproductive trauma, in the historical record doesn't mean women were silent with each other, but it does mean their suffering was socially devalued, considered too mundane and too specifically female to warrant attention. By the time a Viking woman reached her late 30s, if she survived, she had likely endured multiple pregnancies, buried several children, sustained permanent physical damage, and accumulated years of psychological trauma from repeated exposure to death and suffering. If she'd been enslaved, multiply all of this suffering by the additional trauma of complete lack of agency and bodily autonomy. If she'd been married very young, add the trauma of childhood pregnancy and interrupted development. If she'd experienced postpartum mental health problems, add untreated depression or psychosis. The cumulative effect was that most women who survived their reproductive years did so as damaged, exhausted, prematurely aged individuals who'd paid an enormous price for the children they'd managed to raise to adulthood. Comparative skeletal analysis of male versus female remains from the Viking Age burial grounds reveals this cumulative toll starkly. When researchers analyse age-related damage, mortality patterns, and physical condition by sex, a clear pattern emerges. Women died younger than men despite men's involvement in warfare, and women showed more severe age-related damage at equivalent ages. A 30-year-old woman's skeleton might show deterioration equivalent to a 50-year-old man's. The female remains show calcium depletion, spinal compression, pelvic damage, and general structural deterioration at rates far beyond what male remains show. This wasn't genetic destiny, but rather the physical price of repeated pregnancy on inadequate nutrition in dangerous conditions. Men's bodies were damaged by labour and occasionally by violence, but women's bodies were systematically destroyed by reproduction. There's a particular tragedy to this cumulative picture when we consider it as a whole. Each individual aspect we've discussed, the hemorrhage risk, the infection danger, the stillbirth rate, the disabilities, the losses, was devastating on its own. But Viking women didn't face these challenges individually. They faced all of them, repeatedly across decades, with each challenge compounding the effects of the others. The woman who'd barely survived a hemorrhage after her second birth faced her third pregnancy with a weakened, damaged body. The woman who'd lost 3 children to early death approached her fourth pregnancy with accumulated grief and probably diminished emotional investment. The woman who'd been repeatedly pregnant on inadequate nutrition faced each subsequent pregnancy with increasingly depleted physical reserves. This was the reality for Viking women. Lives structured around repeated exposure to potentially lethal biological processes, bodies gradually destroyed by cumulative reproductive demands, psychological trauma from repeated loss and suffering, and social systems that value them primarily for their ability to endure this destruction and produce surviving children. By age 35, most women who'd survived bore the physical and psychological scars of years of this repeated trauma. Many didn't survive at all. They died in their teens or 20s, casualties of a biological process their society demanded they endure repeatedly despite the enormous danger. So as we near the end of our exploration of Viking Age pregnancy, remember that this wasn't ancient history to be dismissed as irrelevant to modern life. The women who suffered through this lived less than 1,000 years ago, roughly 40 generations back, close enough that their genetic descendants walk around today. The medical advances that made pregnancy survivable rather than deadly are mostly less than a century old. Our current reproductive safety is extraordinarily recent, extraordinarily fragile, and dependent on continued access to medical care, nutrition, and technology that much of the world still lacks. Understanding what pregnancy was like for Viking women helps us understand what pregnancy was like for most human women through most of human history, and reminds us how much we owe to modern medicine for the fact that pregnancy is no longer a leading cause of death for young women. The small graves, the skeletal damage, the traumatic burial patterns, all of this testifies to what it cost women to bear the children who became the next generation. and reminds us that taking reproductive safety for granted is a luxury our ancestors couldn't have imagined. And so we reach what might seem like the natural conclusion of our journey through Viking Age pregnancy. We've examined 25 aspects of this difficult topic, from the physical spaces where birth occurred to the cumulative lifetime toll of repeated pregnancy, from the specific dangers of hemorrhage and infection to the systematic exploitation of enslaved women's reproduction. We've seen through archaeological evidence, saga references and skeletal analysis what pregnancy actually meant for women in this period. Not the romanticized vision of strong shield maidens, but the grinding biological reality of bodies destroyed by repeated childbearing in conditions that would appall modern medical professionals. The statistics tell part of the story. 1 in 8 lifetime risk of maternal death, 40–50% infant mortality before age 5, stillbirth rates of 1 in 3 to 4 pregnancies. But behind these numbers were individual women, specific losses, particular suffering. The 14-year-old girl dying in obstructed labour because her pelvis wasn't developed enough for childbirth. The mother of 5 bleeding out on her sleeping bench while her family watched helplessly. The enslaved woman forced to bear her owner's children with no rights over her own body or the infants she delivered. The woman in her 30s with the skeleton of someone twice her age, her body used up by the demands placed on it. We've explored this topic not to shock or to judge Viking culture by modern standards, but rather to understand, to see clearly what pregnancy was actually like before modern medicine, before antibiotics and blood transfusions and caesarean sections, before any real understanding of biology or infection, or what was happening inside a woman's body. This knowledge matters because it shows us how recently our current safety came into being, and how much we owe to medical science for the fact that pregnancy is now survivable, that childbirth is no longer a leading cause of death for young women, that losing half your children is no longer an expected part of parenthood. But perhaps we shouldn't end here. With just the grim statistics and the catalogue of suffering, there's more to consider about what all of this means, about the connections between their world and ours. Because here's what makes this historical exploration particularly urgent. Many of the conditions we've discussed aren't actually historical. Right now, today, in parts of the world without access to modern obstetric care, women face mortality rates and dangers similar to what Viking women experienced. In some developing countries, lifetime risk of maternal death approaches 1 in 50, not as high as the Viking 1 in 8, but still catastrophically higher than the 1 in 5,000, or better, that women in developed countries face. Child marriage continues, meaning girls aged 13 or 15 are becoming pregnant with the same deadly consequences we discussed. Lack of access to caesarean sections means breech births and obstructed labour still kill both mothers and babies. The conditions we've described aren't safely relegated to the past. They're ongoing present-day reality for millions of women. Even in developed countries with modern medical care, access is unequal. Women in rural areas with limited hospital access, women without health insurance, women in communities with closed maternity wards, women from marginalised groups who face discrimination in medical settings. All of these populations experience higher maternal mortality and worse pregnancy outcomes than the general population. The medical advances that make pregnancy safe are only protective if you can access them. The antibiotics that prevent puerperal fever only save lives if you can afford them and reach a provider who'll prescribe them. The blood transfusions that stop hemorrhage only help if you're near a facility equipped to provide them. The systematic reproductive exploitation we discussed, enslaved women forced to bear their owners' children, girls married and impregnated before physical maturity, rape-related pregnancies carried without choice. These aren't just historical horrors either. Modern human trafficking includes forced reproduction. Child marriage continues in many parts of the world. Access to abortion and reproductive health care remains contested, with some women today having as little choice about continuing pregnancies as Viking women did. The bodily autonomy we might take for granted is actually a recent and geographically limited development. still denied to millions of women globally. Understanding Viking pregnancy helps us recognise that our current reproductive rights and safety aren't natural or guaranteed, but rather hard-won achievements that require continued protection and expansion. The medical advances, the legal protections, the social recognition that women deserve autonomy over their own reproduction, all of this is newer than your grandparents and more fragile than we'd like to believe. But perhaps that's not quite the note to end on either. Perhaps there's something more personal to acknowledge. Thank you for staying with me through these difficult hours. I know this hasn't been easy listening. We've explored suffering, death, exploitation, and trauma in considerable detail. This isn't the kind of history that makes for comfortable entertainment or inspiring stories. It's boring history in the truest sense. Methodical, detailed, unglamorous examination of how ordinary people actually lived and died, stripped of romantic gloss or heroic narrative. But I hope it's been valuable. I hope that by understanding what pregnancy actually meant for Viking women, we've gained perspective on how recently human reproduction became something other than a deadly lottery. I hope the small graves and damaged skeletons and disappeared women we've discussed feel real to you now. Not just statistics, but actual people who lived and suffered and in many cases died from biological processes we now manage routinely with modern medicine. To those of you who've experienced pregnancy yourselves, I hope this exploration has given you a sense of connection to women across history who face similar experiences with far fewer resources and far worse outcomes. To those who haven't, I hope you've gained understanding of what pregnancy actually entails and what it cost women throughout most of human history. To everyone, I hope these hours have been what they were meant to be: informative, thought-provoking, and ultimately soporific in the way that long, detailed, methodical history can be. We could end here, with gratitude exchanged and the topic concluded. But the night isn't quite finished, and neither is our conversation. There's one more thing worth considering before we part ways. Picture, if you will, a burial ground on the coast of Norway, excavated by archaeologists in the late 20th century. Among dozens of graves, they found the remains of a young woman, perhaps 25 years old at death. Her skeleton showed she'd borne at least 3 children. Buried near her, not in the same grave but close enough to suggest familial connection, were the tiny remains of 2 infants. Whether these were 2 of her 3 children or other family members, we can't know for certain. But the spatial relationship suggests some connection, some reason these specific bodies ended up in proximity across the centuries. The archaeologists documented everything, measured the bones, recorded the positions, catalogued the few grave goods, took samples for analysis. Then they reburied the remains and marked the location. That woman's name is lost. We don't know what she looked like, what she thought about, what she hoped for, what she feared. We don't know if she died from pregnancy complications or from something else entirely. We don't know if the infants buried near her died at birth or lived for days or weeks before succumbing to the harsh conditions of Viking Age childhood. But we know she existed. We know she bore children in a world that killed mothers routinely. We know her bones show the stress of repeated pregnancy on inadequate nutrition. We know she didn't live to see 30, and we know that somewhere in the genetic mix of modern Scandinavians and of people across Europe and beyond given Viking Age population movements, her DNA persists. Some of you listening tonight might carry fragments of her genetic material, distant echoes of a woman who died 1,000 years ago, from causes we can only infer from skeletal evidence and historical context. This is what history is, ultimately. Not the grand narratives and heroic sagas, but the accumulated lives of ordinary people who faced the challenges of their time with whatever resources they had, who suffered and died and occasionally triumphed, and who left only the faintest traces of their existence for us to puzzle over centuries later. The Viking woman in that Norwegian grave wasn't exceptional. She was one of thousands, tens of thousands, who lived and died in similar circumstances across the Viking Age, but she was also specific, individual, a person whose experiences mattered even though we can never fully know them. So as you drift off tonight, and I do hope you're drifting now, your mind settling after hours of dark history, your body finally releasing the day's tensions, perhaps you can spare a thought for her and all the women like her. Not pitying them exactly, because they didn't pity themselves. This was simply life as they knew it, but acknowledging them, recognising that our current comfort and safety rest on generations of women who survived or didn't survive the biological demands placed on them, who bore and buried children, who endured suffering we can barely imagine, and who kept humanity going despite the enormous cost. Sleep well, dear listener. Whether you're in Stockholm or Seattle, Manchester or Melbourne, whether it's midnight or morning where you are, I hope these hours have given you something valuable. Knowledge, perspective, perhaps even a deeper appreciation for the fragility and recency of our current reproductive safety. If you found value in this exploration, consider subscribing to join our community. Leave a comment sharing where you're listening from, and know that tomorrow, or whenever you wake, the world will still be spinning, the past will still be past, and you'll have the gift of living in an era when pregnancy is survivable, when children usually live, when bodies aren't routinely destroyed by reproduction. Rest now. Let the boring history fade into dreams or into nothing at all. The Viking mothers have been dead for 1,000 years, their suffering long ended, their bones returned to the earth. But their story, told properly and without romantic gloss, remains important. A reminder of where we've come from, and why the medical advances and reproductive rights we sometimes take for granted are worth protecting, worth extending to everyone, worth remembering cost generations of women their health, their bodies, and often their lives. Good night.